A greater than. Socialism in America. From the Shakers to the Third International. Albert Fried was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1930 and attended Brooklyn College and Columbia University. He has taught history at Brooklyn and Queens Colleges in New York. He is the editor of the Essential Jefferson and Day of Dedication, the political writings of Woodrow Wilson, and the Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian traditions in American politics, co-editor of the Essential Lincoln, Charles Booth's London, Socialist Thought, and the author of numerous articles. Socialism in America. From the Shakers to the Third International. A documentary history by Albert Fried. Riverside. Socialism in America. From the Shakers to the Third International was to Bernard G. Richards. Who remembers? OTS. Contents. Preface She. Chapter 1 The Course of American Socialism, A Synoptic. View 1. Chapter 2 Religious Communitarians 16:1. The Shakers. Calvin Green and Seth Y. Wells. A Summary View of the Millennial Church or United Society of Believers 1848-31. 4 months among the Shakers. 1842 to 1843, 46-2. The Perfectionists. John Humphrey Noyes. Bible Communism 1848-54. Chapter 3 The Secular Communitarians 63-1. The Owenites. Comelius C. Blatchley. An Essay on Commonwealth 1822-85. Robert Owen. First Discourse on a New System of Society 1825-94. Francis Wright. Statement on Neshoba, 1826. 02. Langdon Bilesby. Observations on the Sources and Effects of Unequal Wealth 1827-117. Thomas Skidmore. The Rights of Man to Property. 1829-1242. The Associationists A. Albert Brisbane. A Concise Exposition of the Doctrine of Associationism 1843-133. Horace Greeley vs. Henry J. Raymond. Association discussed 1847-149. The Harbinger, Brook Farm, 1845, 161. A. J. MacDonald. Visit to the North American Phalanx, 1851-166. 3. The Icarians. Eddie N. Cabot. The History of the Colony or Republic of Icaria in the United States of America 1855-170. Chapter 4 The Germans 178-1. American Confederation of the International Workingmen's Association. Declaration of Principles and Platform 1872-1962. Friedrich A. Sorge. Socialism and the Worker 1876-1983. Manifesto of the International Working People's Association 1883-2084. Johann Most. The Beast of Property 1884-2135. Speeches at the Chicago Anarchist Trial 1886-221. Speech by August Spies 221. Speech by Michael Schwab 224. Speech by Albert R. Parsons 226-6. Alexander Jonas. Socialism and Anarchism 1886-2307. Henry George vs. Serge Shevich, Single Tax vs. Socialism 1887-234. Mr. Shevich's Argument 234. Henry George's Reply 238. Mr. Shevich's Rejoinder 241. Henry George concludes the debate 242-8. Daniel Delian. Reform or Revolution 1896-244. Chapter 5 The New Apostles 256-1. Lawrence Gronlund. The Cooperative Commonwealth 1884-2732. Edward Bellamy. Equality 1897-2893. Edward Bellamy. Looking Forward 1889-3204. William Dean Howells. A Traveler from Altruria 1894-324. Chapter 6 Christian Socialists I. 2, 3, 4, 5, 335. Declaration of Principles of the Christian Socialist Movement 1889-348. W. D. P. Bliss. What to Do Now, 1890-350. The Christian Commonwealth, 1898-355. George Heron. The New Redemption 1893-362. George Heron. Why I Am a Socialist, 1900-370. Chapter 7 The Socialist Party of America 377-1. Socialist Party Platform of 1912 391-2. Eugene V. Debs. Speech at Indianapolis 1904-3983. William James Gent. The Next Step, A Benevolent Feudalism, 1902-4054. Jack London. What Life Means to Me, 1906-4135. Upton Sinclair. The Industrial Republic 1907-4226. Morris Hillquit. Socialism in Theory and Practice 1909-4307. William English Walling. The Larger Aspect of Socialism 1913-441. Chapter 8 Socialism and the Workers 446-1. Manifesto on Organizing the Industrial Workers of the World 1905-457-2. Eugene V. Debs. Revolutionary Unionism 1905-4623. Hillquit vs. Gompers. Double Edge of Labor's Sword 1914-4714. William D. Haywood. Socialism, the Hope of the Working Class, 1912. Chapter 9 War and Revolution 504-1. Street. Lewis Manifesto of the Socialist Party, 1917, 521-2. Eugene V. Debs. Speech to the Court 1918-5273. Louis C. Freyna. Revolutionary Socialism 1918-5304. Manifesto of the Left-Wing Section of Greater New York 1919-5395. Morris Hillquit. Socialist Task and Outlook 1919-550. Bibliography 558. Index 563. Preface. There is no anthology of this kind now available, and most of the documents appear here for the first time since their original publication. I should emphasize that the book contains only a sampling of a great body of material, most of it known to scholars in the field. The purpose of socialism in America will have been achieved if it arouses the reader to pursue the subject further, make his own discoveries, and arrive at his own conclusions. I wish, first of all, to thank Columbia University for allowing me to use its superb libraries and other facilities. My deepest gratitude goes to my friends for taking so much of their time to help me, too. Erwin Shapiro for advising me a long time ago on how an anthology on American socialism might be organized, to my editors at Anchor Books, Kay Scheuer and Anne Friedgood, for generously applying their talents beyond the call of professional duty, to Judith Block, for patiently listening to me read each of the drafts and then delivering trenchant comments on them, to B. J. Widdick, for his valuable insights and numerous favors, to Ralph Delacava for questioning me on many points of interpretation in detail, and to Richard M. Ellman, for carefully reading the manuscript and criticizing it in depth. My wife, Edith Ferruzzi Fried, collaborated every step of the way, from the inception of the book to its completion. To her I owe more than I can express in words. Chapter I. The Course of American Socialism. A Synoptic View. In the suburb, in the town, on the railway, in the square, came a beam of goodness down, doubling daylight everywhere, peace now each for malice taken, beauty for his sinful weeds, for the angel hope I makes, him an angel whom she leads. RATPH Warpo Emerson, New England Reformers. 6 years ago Ronald Sanders and I brought out an anthology of writings in the history of European socialist thought. The controlling assumption of our book was that modern socialism, despite its failure everywhere to measure up to its original ideals, has been one of the most successful movements of all time. The story need not be retold here. It is sufficient to note that only 100 years ago socialism was an abstract ideal held by a handful of revolutionaries and intellectuals and workers. Today's socialist parties hold power, alone or with other parties, or constitute the main body of opposition, in every country of Western Europe. And as for Eastern Europe, whatever one thinks of the communist regimes there, however profound one's aversion to the brutalities and despotism and subservience to Moscow that have characterized the histories of most of them, they too descend from, or lay claim to, the Western socialist tradition. Our aim was to trace the development of that tradition through documents. In doing so we deliberately omitted American socialism, which we regarded as a minor byproduct of European socialism and, as such, not worth including in a work that attempted to cover so much socialist thought. Anchor Books, New York, 1964. In so little space, we knew that a fairly significant socialist movement had grown up in America before World War I, that it had produced an outstanding public figure in Eugene V. Debs, and that it had attracted the support of such world-famous writers as Jack London, John Reed, and Upton Sinclair. But the movement had suddenly collapsed, and by the time we published our book practically nothing was left of it, only a congeries of sects, all quite small and ineffectual. It was without apologies, therefore, that Sanders and I restricted socialist thought to Europe. Yet my ignorance of American socialism whetted my curiosity about it. I was already aware of the reasons for its failure. These had been spelled out in every study of the subject. Socialism could gain no foothold in a country where a feudal heritage, hence a sense of class consciousness, was missing, where political freedom and social mobility were taken for granted, where the two-party, single-member district system placed insuperable handicaps on third parties. But I was also aware that the socialist tradition was deeply embedded in American life and kept cropping up throughout its history. In due course, I discovered a rich vein of native socialist literature, much of it disintegrating on library shelves, deposited by men, Brisbane, Noyes, Channing, Heron, Spargo, Walling, and others, whom I had heard of or briefly encountered but had never read at length. It became obvious to me that an important part of the American past was being neglected by everyone but the specialist, and I decided to write an extended survey of American socialism, one that would include a representative sampling of its literature. It became obvious to me, too, as I read more deeply, that socialism was not an alien but an integral part of the American past. Here, in fact, lay the root of its failure, of its inability to develop into an independent and sturdy movement. In Europe, socialism, with its radically egalitarian ethic, stood in militant opposition to, or at war with, established authority. Not until the early 20th century, when liberalism had at last triumphed in Western Europe, did socialism acquire legitimacy and take its place as simply another ideology. But the ideals of American socialism were embodied, implicitly at least, in the creation of America itself. America's dominant conception of justice, its ethical norm, was forged in rebellion and insurgency. The principle of the contract, or covenant, assumed that all members of civil society, or the congregation, were equal in rights and duties and were responsible for the authority they would obey. But once agreed to, how was the contract to be applied? Who, in fact, did authority represent? How rigorously was the standard of equality to be observed? What were the permissible limits of inequality? And if impermissible, how was the change to be effected? These questions arose at every stage in the development of the country, before and after the Revolution. Socialism represented itself as the authentic expression of the American egalitarian norm, as the true legatee of the original contract. It would be more accurate to say that America, in the course of its history, called forth a variety of socialisms: communitarian, both religious and secular, Marxist, anarcho-communist, Christian, etc. What animated these socialisms, what underlay their enormous differences, and why it is proper to bring them under the same rubric, was their conviction that each person's obligation to society as a whole was the absolute condition of his equality, that society was a brotherhood, not a collection of strangers drawn together by interest, the usual interpretation of the contract, that the individual derived his highest fulfillment from his solidarity with others, not from the pursuit of advantage and power. Whatever their persuasion, all socialists regarded the opposition of self and society as a false one, reflecting the prevailing ethic of greed and domination. All envisioned an end, really a return to the beginning, in the form either of the perfect community, or the kingdom of heaven on earth, or the cooperative commonwealth, each the realization of the promise of America. Each of the socialisms had its counterpart in a more broadly based contemporary social movement. The religious communities that sprang up in the first half of the 19th century reflected, in their extreme way, the felt disquietude of the times. The periodic eruptions of revivalism and millenarianism, the fear that the world was about to terminate in a fiery holocaust, were typical responses to the changes that were rapidly breaking down accepted values in the customary church-centered community. As the great westward migration got underway in the 1780s and gained momentum in the decades that followed, the religious hegemony of the country burst asunder. New revivalist churches proliferated everywhere, especially in the outlying settlements. Their mission, simply stated, was to re-establish the congregation of saints that seemed to be disappearing in the hurly-burly of economic gain and expansion. But however far they departed from orthodoxy, however antinomian their rituals and organizations, these churches were careful to stay within the Christian fold. They continued, that is, to acknowledge the separation between this world and the next, to profess the doctrine of original sin, and so to assert the mere possibility of election. Inevitably, some religious zealots demanded the unqualified assurance of election. They insisted on going beyond a churchly compromise which symbolically united men to each other and to God. A church, after all, was an invisible congregation of saints. How was it to become a visible one? For those determined at any cost to live free of sin, the answer lay in turning the congregation into a community, in surrendering body and soul to a kingdom of God on earth, perfect in itself, with its own laws, economy, dogma, and mode of worship, above all its own prophet of deliverance. From the 1790s through the 1850s, thousands of Americans made the leap to religious communitarianism, joining the Shaker or perfectionist orders, the two main indigenous sects in the country. There were a host of German colonies, themselves products of the revivalism in the Lutheran world, that were planted in the wilderness during the same period, but they shut themselves up completely and sought no American converts. The Shakers were much the larger of the two native sects. By the 1850s there were 18 Shaker colonies, each containing a minimum of 150 members, and some as many as 600. The one sizable perfectionist community, at Oneida, New York, never accommodated more than a few hundred votaries. In theology and in social behavior the Shakers and perfectionists could not have been more dissimilar. The Shakers, who followed the precepts of the prophetess Mother Ann, believed that celibacy restored to man the state of grace he had lost when Adam and Eve learned to lust for each other's bodies. A tightly drawn hierarchy and an elaborate set of rules sustained the Shaker system of celibate communism. The perfectionists lived in strict conformity to the teachings of John Humphrey Noyes, who interpreted the fall as the consequence of selfish and exclusive desire. To redeem sin, he invented the institution of complex marriage, i.e., the sexual union, under group supervision, of all adult males and females. But whatever their dissimilarities, Shakers and perfectionists, and the foreign sects, too, for that matter, were distinguished by what they held in common. Being millenarians, they lived in a state of suspended time. They had appropriated the future, merging it with the present. In preparation for the day of reckoning, they had united their separate selves into the communal family, led by the prophet founder. They had discovered the only real security against the ravages of change and disorder that afflicted the world at large. An ancient drama was thus reenacted in America. Only it was a drama void of the violence and the tragic effects of the past. Millenarianism had been a cardinal heresy throughout the history of Western Christendom, and had been stamped out with fire and sword by the Orthodox churches, Protestant as well as Catholic, whenever it appeared. America, however, left the communitarian sects alone. In a society without established churches, divided into a multiplicity of denominations, they lived in tranquility. But the industrialization of the country and the creation of an all-enveloping market economy after the Civil War inevitably doomed the small-scale, communal-size unit of production. Moreover, as society grew more secular, so fewer people took religion seriously enough to seek salvation through communitarianism. Slowly, peaceably, the sects died out one by one, some of them enduring well into the 20th century. The tradition of Western millenarianism died with them. Most Americans, even in an age of religious enthusiasm, were content to take salvation as it came, as a gratuitous gift of God. Their abiding concern was how to achieve happiness in this world. The pursuit of happiness, not salvation, was their birthright, ratified by war and revolution and inscribed in their Charter of National Independence. Yet as the 19th century wore on, it became clear that the ideal of happiness contained serious ambiguities, even contradictions. The Declaration of Independence underscored that the unalienable rig of equality, to the advantage of the few and against the well-being of the majority. But the majority responded by demanding the Shakers, it is true, were persecuted in the early 1780s. Mother Anne herself was beaten up, but not so much for religious reasons as political. Some of the communities in which they proselytized took them to be pro-British. Extension of liberty so that they might be enabled to participate, with a fair chance of succeeding, in the great quest for property. The pursuit of happiness meant equality of opportunity. From the 1820s on, some Americans challenged this conventional view of happiness. By and large, they were intellectuals and professionals living in the larger cities of the East who were offended, perhaps threatened, by the changes and the conflicts they witnessed firsthand. At any rate, they pointed out the cruel paradox inherent in the ethic of individualism, according to which the maximum degree of individualism led to the maximum degree of social harmony and rationality, relations between men resembling a smoothly functioning machine. But the evidence already demonstrated that America was farther from harmony and rationality than ever. It was divided into sharply contending political factions, it sanctioned the suffering of the poor and the indulgences of the rich, and it accepted one economic crisis after another, the alternations of boom and bust, as acts of God. Opposition to the morality of the system prompted these critics to take the next step. They established their own secular communities of cooperation, communities where economic concerns would be relegated to their properly subordinate place, where life would no longer be left to the uncertainties of the open market but would be rationally planned, where the invidious distinctions of class and status would be effaced once and for all, where every activity and function, industrial, agricultural, artistic, intellectual, etc., would be organically united, and where individuals would cease to be predators and become members of the same family. The community, in a word, would be precisely what existing society was not, a center of education, virtue, and happiness. Secular communitarianism embraced two movements. The first in point of time consisted of the followers of Robert Owen, the famous British philanthropist and manufacturer. Owen had come to espouse the cause of villages of cooperation, on concluding, from his own experiences as a reformer, that mankind could not be educated in a capitalist or selfishly individualist society. The seeds of the Owenite faith had been planted years before Owen himself, in 1825, set up the New Harmony, Indiana, community. Within months after it had been opened, New Harmony was filled beyond its capacity, and numerous other communities, from Ohio to New York, suddenly sprouted at the same time. These secular communitarians believed that the rest of America would soon be converted by the self-evident truths they were promulgating in word and deed, that their moral idealism would lay the groundwork on which to build the society of the future. But the habits of the past, the habits of individualism, were not to be shaken off so easily. And none of the Owenite communities were as fortunate as New Harmony, which at least had abundant reserves of capital. Yet all of them, New Harmony included, were short-lived. By 1830 none of them survived. When the secular communitarian movement re-emerged in the 1840s, it was only one of a great number of reform movements that swept the North. The cultured middle class of the cities and towns, threatened more than ever by the accelerated pace of economic change, took up such causes as anti-slavery, the rights of women, public schools, temperance, world peace, etc. One of its causes was associationism, a term adopted by the disciples of the late Charles Fourier. Fourier claimed to have discovered the principle uniting all things in the universe, from inanimate matter to complex relations between men. This was the principle of attraction, an elaborated, extended, and refined version of Newton's law of gravitation. Civilization, Fourier maintained, had failed because it had suppressed the passions, the force of attraction native to man. To liberate the passions, he invented the phalanx, or association, a community roughly the same size as Owen's ideal village of cooperation, where perfect harmony would prevail within each man, thus reconciling mind and body, thought and action, between man, and between man and nature. Associationism caught on quickly, especially among old-line Unitarians and Transcendentalists for whom the principle of attraction, culminating in the organization of the phalanx, furnished the hope of a new epiphany. But the associationists, even more than the Owenites, were unfitted for the harsh labors and dull routine of communal life. Also, the price of land, labor, and capital was much more expensive than it had been 20 years before. And so Fourierists suffered the same fate as their Owenite predecessors. Scores of phalanxes arose in the 1840s, all but one had disappeared within a decade. The demise of associationism marked the end of secular communitarianism in America. Marx was justified, then, in applying the epithet, utopian, to the various communitarianisms of the early 19th century. It was true that they sought to resist the advance of industrialism, that the doctrines put forward by their founders were arbitrary and ahistorical, that their abstract moral injunctions seemed to bear no relation to the reality they proposed to change. Yet the fact remained that the communitarians upheld the ideals of social solidarity and individual good to which Americans in general paid homage. It was in the country at large, after all, that the gap between ethical norms and the imperatives of practical life had been widening. The gap, that is, between the old-fashioned ideal of the integrated community and the increasingly atomized, fragmented, and mobile nature of American society. In the 30 years or so following the Civil War, the United States was suddenly transformed from an agricultural country to the mightiest industrial nation on earth. Yet these were years of political stability, if not quietude. By way of contrast, the same process of change in Europe called forth a vigorous socialist movement, one that rested on the support of the working class and looked forward to the acquisition of state power, peacefully, if possible, violently if necessary. Why did a comparable movement fail to take root in America? For one thing, America was open and free and profoundly averse to class consciousness and class politics. For another, its labor force, being largely foreign-born, lacked a sense of social and cultural solidarity. Perhaps most important, America was still traumatized by the Civil War. It had had enough of conflicts and crusades. It wanted nothing more than to lose itself in work and in the relentless accumulation of wealth. Americans welcomed industrialism as a sort of therapy, and the sudden appearance of an enormous capitalist oligarchy disturbed them less than the prospect of disorder. Such socialism as did exist was confined to a tiny group of German immigrants, most of them professionals and intellectuals. They brought their radical critique of modern society with them to the New World, where they settled in the larger cities of the Northeast and Midwest. One can easily dismiss them, as writers on American socialism usually do, as incorrigible doctrinaires who were bound to fail, since America was hardly in the mood for a heavy dose of reform, much less socialism, least of all one administered by foreigners. But it should be pointed out that these German socialists were under no illusion about the difficulty of their task. They expected no imminent mass conversions. What they did expect was that sooner or later the structure of industrial capitalism would crash down of its own weight, and that the working class, by then the majority of the people, would pick up the pieces and build a wholly new society. The cooperative commonwealth, a phrase that came into vogue in the 1870s. Let it be said further in their defense that the Germans tried to make their ideas palatable to the public, especially after they formed the Socialist Labor Party in 1877. They campaigned in elections, offered their own candidates for office, and whenever feasible joined labor and reformist groups. America, however, offered them no chance of discovering a middle ground between political assimilation and sectarianism. One reason Americans turned a deaf ear to German socialism was that it seemed to lack a moral dimension. Americans had once been attracted to communitarianism because it had presented a vision of equality, harmony, and virtue that was pure and transcendent. It had withdrawn from the world in order to save it. The German socialists, too, postulated an ideal of equality, harmony, and virtue. Only they proposed to reach it by apparently paradoxical means. To end class warfare, they argued, one must intensify it, by siding with the oppressed workers. To end the monopolization of industry, one must favor the monopolists, who were inadvertently preparing the way for the nationalization of the means of production and distribution. To end political domination, one must advocate the extension of government authority, which, on falling to the proletariat, would be used to usher in the cooperative commonwealth. Americans did not grasp this kind of dialectical reasoning, according to which conditions must worsen before they can be improved. And certainly reform-minded Americans rejected the socialist argument out of hand. They were reformers precisely because they believed in individualism and laissez-faire and property rights. Their complaint was that such rights were inequitably distributed, and they regarded socialism as the substitution of one kind of monopoly for another. Nonetheless, some Americans came to see the world as the German socialists did. The country was in fact being split into classes. Interruptedly, it was harder and harder to sustain the pretense that the government was impartial in administering the laws and responsive to the popular will in passing them. Under the circumstances, a new socialist literature appeared in America in the late 1880s and early 1890s, best exemplified by the popular writings of Lawrence Gronlund, Edward Bellamy, and William Dean Howells. Their detailed descriptions of the cooperative commonwealth to come bore witness to the influence that German socialism, seeping up through subterranean channels, was beginning to exert on the American mind. Gronlund, whose cooperative commonwealth laid the intellectual foundations for Bellamy's Looking Backward, and Howells, a traveler from Altruria, was a longtime member of the Marxist Socialist Labor Party. They adopted the German socialist view that capitalism must be understood objectively, dispassionately, scientifically, that it was expanding and evolving in obedience to the laws of historical inevitability, and that it must, accordingly, metamorphose into the cooperative commonwealth, the highest stage of civilization. But Gronlund, Bellamy, and Howells diverged sharply from German socialism in their motives for wanting the cooperative commonwealth established, and therefore in the means they advocated for its realization. The prospect of class conflict appalled them. If the proletariat won their sympathy, it was not as heroes but as victims. On principle, they abhorred an ethic that exalted class interest as much as one that exalted individual interest. They looked to the disinterested idealists of America, the educated, the professionals, the men of conscience and hope, in short, the enlightened middle class, to be the agents of transition and the leaders of the new order. The America they envisioned was to embody a fundamental shift in values, away from property, conflict, selfishness, and domination, and toward the organic solidarity of man and man, man and society, man and work, toward the unchallenged supremacy of art and science and leisure over economics. It is clear what these apostles of the cooperative commonwealth had accomplished. They had fused German, or scientific, socialism and native communitarianism. They had given socialism a distinctively American cast. Their ideas were caught up in the great turbulence of the 1890s. The decade opened with the spectacular rise of the Bellamyite, or nationalist, movement. Thousands of morally troubled middle class Americans joined nationalist clubs and discussion groups in hopes of bringing the new society into existence well before the year 2000. Closely akin to the Bellamites were the Christian socialists, who had officially begun their career in 1889, after breaking away from one of the nationalist clubs. Apart from resting their arguments on the authority of Christ, the Christian socialists differed not at all from the apostles of the cooperative commonwealth. They prophesied that the kingdom of heaven was about to descend, that Christ would reappear with the dissolution of capitalism. The Christian socialists were important far beyond their numbers, for they represented the logical culmination of the whole social gospel movement that was attempting to liberalize the Protestant churches. For a while it seemed that a significant socialist clergy would emerge in America. These essentially urban, middle class, and rather genteel desires for reform accompanied more active expressions of discontent. The number of working men enrolled in trade unions rose perceptibly, and the threat of labor insurgency grew more ominous than ever. Meanwhile, the farmers of the South and West rebelled against the plutocrats and the politicians who served them. In the early 1890s, a series of rather fruitful ad hoc alliances sprang up between the nationalists, the Christian socialists, the populists, and the trade unions. These proved ephemeral. The nationalist clubs suddenly melted away, and the populist and Christian socialist crusades lost their momentum. The Depression of 1893, which provoked random acts of protests and several important strikes, all of them put down without difficulty, destroyed whatever possibility there once might have been for an enduring radical coalition. The conservative mood of the country was reflected in the overwhelming victory of William McKinley and the Republican Party. The left by 1897 was reduced to two main components. One consisted of the liberal and moderate reformers who had sided with William Jennings Bryan in the recent election. The other consisted of the Socialist Labor Party, headed by Daniel Delian, an orthodox Marxist who symbolized the changes that had lately come over the socialist movement. It was no longer a predominantly German movement. It now contained a large number of Native Americans, again, mostly urban and middle class, along with Russian Jews and other newly arrived immigrant groups. As further evidence of its Americanization, the SLP was regularly offering candidates in elections and was receiving more and more votes. At the same time, however, the party was disintegrating, thanks to De Leon's PU-mist ideology and personal authoritarianism. Most galling to the SLP's rank and file was his policy of establishing unions to compete with the non-socialist ones, in particular the American Federation of Labor. As a result, one faction of the party after another broke away from De Leon and gravitated toward a reformist brand of socialism. Those segments of the American left dissatisfied with liberalism and De Leonism eventually came together and formed the Socialist Party of America. Specifically, it was the product of a merger in 1901 between Eugene V. Debs, the immensely popular labor leader, and his followers and a sizable contingent of SLP dissidents. The character of the Socialist Party was defined at the start of its career. It was an amalgam of workers, intellectuals, farmers, professionals, ethnic minorities, and radicals of every stripe. And though it spoke the language of Marx and class struggle and revolutionary change, it was essentially moderate and constructive. It represented itself as merely another political party seeking to democratize American life. It tended to be idealistic in the manner of the Christian socialists and the nationalist clubs. It was a party consecrated to the materialization of the cooperative commonwealth. It was an American party in style and in substance, espousing a cause rooted in the American tradition and made up mostly of American bomb members and leaders. Just as the communitarian movement was a part of the liberalism characteristic of the pre-Civil War era, so the socialist movement was inseparable from the progressivism characteristic of the first decade and a half of the 20th century. The popular impulse for reform provided the nutriment for the spectacular growth of the Socialist Party. The extraordinary rise in the number of votes cast for Debs, its regular presidential candidate, the rise in the number of offices it won in local and state elections, of newspapers and magazines it published, of people who signed up as members. These indexes of success gave the socialists reason to believe that the party would take power in the near future. This being so, prudence dictated that it play down the theme of class struggle. Why should the party run the risk of antagonizing its primary sources of support, the middle class, unionized labor, and small farmers, when it stood so close to achieving a breakthrough? At every turn, it rejected, or cast out from its midst, those who veered too far to the left. That was why it resolutely refused to support the militant industrial workers of the world, and why it purged itself of syndicalists. The Socialist Party, in sum, was at once pragmatic in its quest for power in an imperfect world and intensely idealistic in its hope for a thoroughgoing transformation of American values. But that transformation lay in the future and waited upon circumstances, the collapse of the system, the discontent of the masses, beyond its control. But the future did not come. The circumstances that confronted the Socialist Party of America were not those it anticipated or was prepared to deal with. The system endured. It was the party and the movement that collapsed. America's entry into World War I confronted the Socialist Party with a dangerous choice: whether to follow the example of the other socialist parties in the belligerent countries. Italy's Socialist Party was the lone exception, and support the war, or, by opposing it, court the displeasure of the masses whom it was trying to win over. It chose, by an overwhelming vote of its membership, to oppose the war. It immediately lost a high proportion of its intellectuals, its Native American members, and its trade union backing. Many of these former socialists went on to accuse the party publicly of treason and to call for its punishment. This was precisely the opinion of the Wilson administration, which, armed with plenary authority, imprisoned party leaders, terrorized its members, and shut down its publications. In effect, the party went underground for the duration. Yet it might have recovered even after the war. Conditions were ripe for a large-scale insurgent movement. The country was disillusioned. Many liberals who felt betrayed by Wilson had nowhere to go, and workers and farmers were more discontented than at any time since the 1890s. It turned out, however, that the Socialist Party was incapable of taking advantage of the mass unrest. It suffered from a deep-seated, ultimately fatal, malaise, the cause of which could be traced to the Russian Revolution of November 1917. The party had no quarrel with the aims of the Bolsheviks. After all, it too favored ending the war, and it was not averse to a general rising of the European, or American, proletariat. But hardly had the Soviet regime attained a modicum of stability than it pursued a two-front war of its own. Against the capitalists and against the renegade socialists of the Second International, including, of course, the Socialist Party of America. The Soviets encouraged the party's left wing, hitherto a small minority, but now bolstered by a great influx of Eastern European foreign language groups, to overthrow its long-established leadership and policies. Following the Bolshevik example, the left wing proclaimed revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat as its immediate goals. It also followed the Bolshevik example in forming an elite, vanguard party of activists, the spiritual embodiment of all history, as it were, to lead the masses in revolt. The differences between the two factions in the party were insuperable, and in the summer of 1919 the American Socialist movement broke into pieces. It was all downhill after that. The Socialist Party became an exceedingly minor political entity, a bare simulacrum of its former self. The Communists, who for a time were themselves divided into rival parties, though they claimed a larger membership, one, moreover, that was young, idealistic, and talented, were even less relevant than the Socialists. The Communists identified themselves not only with the cause of Marxism-Leninism, but with its homeland, the Soviet Union. Increasingly, they took their orders from the Soviet Union, or, what was the same thing, the Third International. The decline of American socialism, arrested briefly in the 1930s, when the Depression struck and fascism appeared on the horizon, was inexorable. Hardly anything was left of it after World War II, the period of the Cold War and the McCarthy persecutions. Today, circa 1970, there is a melange of very tiny socialist sects, communist, Trotskyite, socialist labor, and others, that endure on the outermost margins of American life. The New Left, which emerged in the 1960s on the strength of the civil rights movement, the protests against the Vietnam War, and the increasingly experimental character in personal styles and habits, is too amorphous and syncretistic to define with any assurance. Its hallmark, in fact, lies in its indefinability, its looseness and deliquescence. It appeals mainly to disaffected youth, most of them from middle-class homes, who find little in America worth redeeming. It is indifferent to the issues, reform versus revolution, the nature of the Soviet Union, the viability of capitalism, the organization of the working class, etc., that meant so much to previous generations of radicals. These issues it regards as so many hang-ups, calculated to destroy spontaneity and authenticity. The New Left seems to favor forms of socialism that are at once extremely libertarian and extremely authoritarian. Its heroes are a mixed bag of native black militants, e.g., Malcolm X and Eldridge Cleaver, and exotic Latin American and Far Eastern revolutionaries, such as Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Mao Zedong, and Ho Chi Minh. Despite the interest it has called forth, the New Left is still only a mood, and moods are notoriously fugacious. It will be understood, then, why I have ended the book with the collapse of the Socialist Party and the creation of the Third International in 1919. These events sounded the knell of defeat for socialism in America, at least down to the present, that there have been interesting struggles between socialist and communist groups over the years, that both have on occasion played an important part in American life, for example, the formation of the largest industrial unions, steel, autos, electrical, etc., in the 1930s, goes without saying. But a pall has settled over the American socialist movement for the last half-century, a pall that has grown heavier with time and now appears to be a permanent feature of the landscape. Chapter 2. Religious Communitarians. Be faithful to keep the gospel, be neat and industrious. Put your hands to work and your hearts to God. Ann Lee. The marriage of the flesh is a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Ann Lee. We love to dance, we love to sing. We love to taste the living spring. We love to feel our union flow. Which round and round and round we go. Shaker, millennial praises. We are not free lovers, in any sense that makes love less binding or responsible than it is in marriage. Oneida Handbook. We can now see our way to victory over death. Reconciliation with God opens the way for the reconciliation with the sexes. Reconciliation of the sexes emancipates women, and opens the way for vital society. Vital society increases strength, diminishes work and makes labor attractive, thus removing the antecedents of death. First we abolish sin, then shame, then the curse on women of exhausting childbearing, then the curse on man of exhausting labor, and so we arrive regularly at the tree of life. June Humphrey Noyes. Bible Communism. One day in June 1779, a group of men and women in the village of New Lebanon, situated in the New York Berkshires, just over the Massachusetts boundary, set up a provisional church in a local barn. Their regular Congregational and Presbyterian churches had left them dissatisfied. The possibility of salvation had grown too remote and too dependent on reasoning and leeming. Now, in the sanctuary of a barn, they could bear witness to Christ's presence without the impediments of tradition and ceremony, symbol and rite. Possessed by the Holy Ghost, transported by the ecstasy of redemption, they moaned and shrieked and trembled before collapsing to the ground as though they were wounded in battle. The revival of Christ went on this way night after night throughout the summer and fall of 1779. Meetings like the one at New Lebanon were not unusual. They had been taking place in the interior of the country since the 1730s and 40s, the time of Great Awakening. It was common for poorer frontier communities to break away from their increasingly formal and hieratic parent churches and to establish new denominations based on the Baptist, or Anabaptist, principle of direct communion with God. A communion requiring no intermediaries, no external authorities, no theology. But the Great Awakening, for all the passion it generated, was itself no revolutionary departure. It continued a tradition that had begun with the Puritan fathers. Schism, after all, was built into the Calvinist doctrine, which in its most radical form asserted that nothing may stand between the individual congregation and God. Successful heresy, however, had a way of hardening into orthodoxy. After the Dionysian phase of revivalism passed, the ad hoc churches tended to become permanent ones in their turn. At New Lebanon, too, the revival quickly exhausted itself, and the people who had met each night in the barn soon met only on the Sabbath, in their newly formed Baptist church. But some of these radical or New Light Baptists were as profoundly convinced as ever that the second coming was at hand. They had had a vision of the kingdom of heaven. Nothing could now stop them from entering it. They had heard that a tiny English group, the United Society of Believers, who lived near Albany in a place called Niskayuna, now Watervliet, claimed to be the true millennial church. They decided to investigate the matter further. On May 10, 1780, 3 of the New Lebanon Baptists, led by one Joseph Meacham, were welcomed at Niskayuna by the whole body of believers, 13 members in all, including their prophetess, Mother, Ann Lee. The visitors were impressed by the appearance, the manners, and the comportment of the believers, by the comfortable, well-wrought cabins, by the large tracts of cleared land and the stores of food and fuel. The visitors were impressed still more by the responses to their questions. At one point, Meacham asked the believers, "Are you perfect? Do you live without sin?" The answer was yes. The power of God, revealed in this day, does enable souls to cease from sin, and we have received that power. We have actually jeffed off committing sin, and we live in daily obedience to the will of God. To Arith. The high point of the day was the worship period. Meacham and his companions had looked forward to this moment. How their hosts prayed would tell them, as no words or conscious acts could, what they wanted to know. They observed a scene very much like the following one, which was reported by another visitor a few weeks later. The believers, he wrote, begin their worship by sitting down and shaking their heads in a violent manner, turning their heads half round, so that their face looks over each shoulder, their eyes being shut. While they are thus shaking, one will begin to sing some odd tune, without words or rule. After a while another will strike in, and then another, and after a while they all fall in, and make a strange charm. The mother, so-called, minds to strike such notes as make a concord, and so form the charm. When they leave off singing, they drop off, one by one, as oddly as they come on. In the best part of their worship everyone acts for himself, and almost everyone different from the other. One will stand with his arms extended, acting over odd postures, which they call signs. Another will be dancing, and sometimes hopping on one leg about the floor. Another will fall to turning round, so swift, that if it be a woman, her clothes will be so filled with the wind, as though they were kept out by a hoop. Another will be prostrate on the floor. Another will be talking with somebody, and some sitting by, smoking their pipes. Some groaning most dismally. Some trembling extremely. Others acting as though all their nerves were convulsed. Others swinging their arms, with all vigor, as though they were turning a wheel, etc. Then all break off, and have a spell of smoking, and sometimes great fits of laughter. The reason the believers came to be called Shakers, a name to which they had no objection, is obvious from this description. To outsiders they often seem quite mad or, like Don Quixote, an incomprehensible mixture of madness and sobriety. To anyone familiar with the revivalist tradition, however, the Shakers' way of worship was distinguished only by the intensity and frequency of their raptures. But as Meacham was quick to recognize, the Shakers were different from run-of-the-mill revivalists. Their religious experience was shuga, obese row feeling, more than a spontaneous abolition. It was integral to their whole way of life. It was that every moment was privileged. So it appeared to Meacham and his companions, who joined the United Society of Believers on the spot he returned to New Lebanon to spread the good news that less than Messiah they meant Ann Lee. They had become Shakers because they believed in her divinity. To them she was the Word, the chosen instrument of BND. She had been born in 1736, the second of 8 children of a Manchester blacksmith. Unremitting poverty, toil, and misfortune was her lot in early life and in marriage. All of her 4 children died at birth or in infancy. She belonged to a group of religious dissidents, simple working-class people like herself, who bore witness to Christ by shaking, groaning, writhing, collapsing, and the like. They were caught up in the English version of the Great Awakening, the Wesleyan, or Methodist, movement that stirred the passions of the country's poor in the mid-18th century. Shortly after the death of her last child, Ann Lee gave evidence of possessing special thaumaturgic powers. Her prop-head examinations convinced the members of Het SRE had chosen her to complete his mission. "It is not I who speak of, she declared, it is Christ who dwells in me." Christ was her lover, her husband, her Lord. He embraced her and took her as his. Feel the blood of Christ running through my soul and body. From hers, she identified concupiscence as the source of the evil and suffering and folly that have afflicted man since the fall. Renunciation of lust would, she said, lead to the renunciation of desire, as such, and therefore to the triumph of the spiritual over the material self. And so Anne Lee, now Mother Anne, revived the venerable Christian heresy of millenarianism, the belief that the millennium had arrived and that men must prepare themselves, by faith and works, for the day of judgment. In her quiet, unobtrusive way she was following in the footsteps of such notorious medieval movements as the Cathari, the Albigensians, and the Waldensians, as well as the various Anabaptist sects of the Reformation and the English Civil War. She too bore the consequences of her extreme dissidence. She was subjected to continuous persecution by her neighbors and by civil and religious authorities. Conditions in England having grown intolerable, Mother Anne and her little flock decided to go to America, where they could live openly and freely as a family. They sailed in 1774. 2 years later they were securely settled at Niskayuna. Anne Lee died in 1784. Leadership of the Shakers shortly after fell to Joseph Meacham, their first American convert, whom she had once described as her first bishop, the keeper of the keys of the kingdom. With his accession, New Lebanon became the center of the millennial church. The Shakers ceased to be an English sect and emerged as an American one. Since Meacham's first visit to Niskayuna, the sect had grown rapidly, nearly all of its recruits being native-born. The critical problem that faced him was how the church could continue to expand yet avoid succumbing to the temptations of the world. Under Mother Anne this problem had been less compelling, first because of her holy presence, and second, because the nucleus of the sect had consisted of the original band of apostles. It had not been necessary, therefore, to ban every form of selfishness at Niskayuna, such as the ownership of private property and the maintenance of separate families. Meacham's solution was to convert the Shaker religion into a communitarian theocracy. He ordered the believers to yield up their possessions to the church and to move inside the New Lebanon compound. There they were to live and work as members of a single collective family. They pledged to give themselves and their services with all their temporal interest, for the mutual support and benefit of each other, and for the charitable uses, according to the light court head and revelation of God which they have received, and so the last remnant of concupiscence was removed. The Shakers now belonged to an autonomous, tightly knit communist society. The purity of their faith was assured. But the price of this assurance was withdrawal from the world, from Christendom at large. Even the most extreme of the New Light Baptists subscribed to Augustinian Calvinist tenets and continued to believe in original sin, the Trinity, the gift of salvation, a gift to which men could lay no claim whatever. The Shakers announced that they had received the gift, they had overcome sin, and they had achieved unity with God. The economic system that arose at New Lebanon, and at every other Shaker settlement, flowed directly from their ethical and religious absolutes. The desires of each member were ruthlessly simple. Superfluities were forbidden, and the merest display of extravagance, in taste as in behavior, was an abomination. The Shakers labored neither to accumulate nor to consume, but to live perfect lives in the sight of God. Everything about them reflected the sacramental nature of their calling. Their dress, furniture, and buildings were austere and durable, models of elegant utility. And the goods they produced, e.g., baskets, cloth, chairs, blankets, bonnets, brooms, were so well made they instantly found a market in the outside. But the Shakers could not afford to take their spiritual fellowship for granted. They constituted a minuscule island in an ocean of sin and depravity. To maintain the community's distance from the world, to foreclose the possibility of personal backsliding, Meacham laid down a vast and complicated set of rules. Celibacy, the foundation of the Commonwealth, was scrupulously aimed. The brethren and sisters were kept as far apart from each other as the business of community life permitted. They could not pass each other on the stairs, visit or write or in any way communicate with each other except under supervision. When the brethren and sisters met, the sexual taboos were extreme. The men had to stay at least 5 feet from the women, who were not allowed to whisper, wink, or cross their legs. Shakers hardly ever broke these rules, but they often confessed to evil intentions or to weaknesses of the flesh. They were afflicted by more, not less, guilt than the fallen and unredeemed. They had discovered the way to perfection. Their problem was to avoid straying from it. Equality of the sexes was a fundamental article of the Shaker. S's, nay, NYT, creed, and the brethren and sisters jointly presided over the government, an uncompromising, rigidly hierarchical theocracy. At the summit of the hierarchy stood the holy anointed, Father Meacham and his helpmate, Mother Lucy Wright, who, as the leading ministry of New Lebanon, could pass, alter, or repeal any regulation at any of the Shaker vineyards. Immediately below the leading Ministry were the elders and eldresses, who ruled over families of from 30 to 100 members each, 2 or more families comprising a bishopric or colony. The elders and eldresses were required to hear confessions and to know everything owned and possessed by everyone under their charge. Acting as intermediaries between the members and the hierarchs were the deacons and deaconesses and the trustees. They took care of the family's business transactions, its relations with other families, and its trade with the great and wicked cities of the world. It might appear, then, that the Shakers led insufferably circumscribed lives, the more so since they had nothing to say in choosing their superiors or their laws. But if their society was a despotism, it was one to which they submitted voluntarily and only for so long as they liked. They reared the freedom of the world as frivolous, illusory, ephemeral at most. True freedom for them lay exclusively in the Holy King Ges main lm vo pe tilde Meacham also worked out a Shaker theodicy, culminating, of course, in the person of Mother Ann. Adam and Eve sinned when they yielded to sexual desire. This was the knowledge of good and evil that God wished to conceal from them. 4 illuminating moments in history, or dispensations of grace, followed the fall. The patriarchate of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the covenant between God and Moses, the advent of Christ, who was the promise of redemption, and the appearance of Mother Ann, who fulfilled the promise by restoring the prelapsarian virginity of soul and body. The conversion of mankind to the millennial church was prophesied by Ezekiel and Daniel. The Shakers acknowledged that it might take a long time for the glorious day to come. They were patient. They had transcended the limits of mortality. By the time Joseph Meacham died in 1797, the Shakers had demonstrated that they could not only survive, they could prosper and increase. No fewer than 9 Shaker bishoprics had sprung up on the New England frontier, 4 in western Massachusetts, 2 each in New Hampshire and Maine, and 1 in Connecticut, each of them containing 2 or more families and housing from 200 to 800 members. Never had the country witnessed anything like this successful experiment in native religious communitarianism. There had been religious communitarian sects before the Shakers, but all save one had either disappeared after a few years in the wilderness, or, like the Moravian Brethren and the Hutterites, had jettisoned their experiment in communism. The lone exception was the Ephrata cloister of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which had been founded in 1732. By the end of the century it had lost much of its vitality. After 3 ALSUO entered another period of expansion, this time mainly into Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. And once again they drew their adherents, thousands of them, from the extreme left wing of a new revivalist movement, the so-called Second Awakening, that swept the frontier with powerful animus in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. As the Shaker kingdom grew, so its character imperceptibly changed. Its rituals became more formalized and decorous. The individual paroxysms of Mother Ann's Day were replaced by collective dancing and singing. The hermeneutics laid down by Meacham were enlarged and embellished by succeeding generations of believers. Meanwhile, a Shaker publication industry had emerged, partly to satisfy an increasingly interested public, and partly to answer their apostates, some of whom wrote sensational accounts of their sexual behavior. The Shakers brought out an immense number of tracts explaining their history, theology, and way of life in general. Their decline could be arranged by the intensity of their preoccupation with the past and by the number of apologies they were constrained to write. In addition, there were the reports by visitors to Shaker communities. One could compile a volume of articles or brief descriptions on the Shakers by such men as Emerson, Cooper, Greeley, Hawthorne, and Whitman. It was de rigueur for foreign authors to drop in on the Shakers, who were unfailingly cordial to their guests. Nearly every one of these visitors, American and foreign both, admired the well-ordered little communities they saw, where crime and poverty and the distempers of everyday life were absent, and where the fundamental Christian virtues were honored more in the observance than in the breach. Dickens, however, found all the virtue tiresome and dull. We walked into a grim room, he wrote in his American notes, where several grim hats were hanging on grim pegs, and the time was told by a grim clock which uttered every tick with a kind of struggle, as if it broke the grim silence reluctantly and under protest. While the Shakers were expanding into the West, a second chapter in the history of American religious communitarianism opened with the appearance of the foreign sects. In 1805, Father George Rapp and his flock of German farmers and mechanics planted a colony in Pennsylvania and called it Harmony. In 1817, another German community, the Separatists, settled in Zoar, Ohio. In the 1840s, 2 more German millennial communities arose. The true inspirationists formed theirs at Ebenezer, near Buffalo, New York in 1843, and the followers of William Kyle formed theirs in Bethel, Missouri a year later. Finally, in 1856, Eric Jansen and his Swedish brethren established a colony in Bishop Hill, Illinois. These were the most prominent of the foreign communities. They had nothing in common with the Shakers, or, with a single exception, some of the Bethelites had once lived under Father Rapp, with each other. The fact that they were all millenarian sects, each convinced by infallible signs of its election, precluded cross-fertilization or continuity of experience and thought. Each was a completely self-enclosed unit. What they did have in common with each other, and with the Shakers too, was the same process of development, the same formal cause, as it were. They all started out as dissenters from established churches during a period of general religious disquietude. Just as Mother Ann had been a member of a group that had broken with the Anglican Church, so Rapp and Kyle and Jansen and the other prophets were swept up by the strong pietist current in the Lutheran Church that began in the late 18th century and continued through the 1820s and 30s. As in America, so in these parts of Europe, the religious rebels tended to be poor and simple folk who no longer felt at home with a ministry that served the rich or the urban middle class, that spoke the language of the schools, and that rested on a self-perpetuating, increasingly remote ecclesiastical oligarchy. Their motive for coming to America was also similar: to maintain the integrity of the group, more precisely, to transform it into a family headed by the founding Messiah. Once established as a community, the family received its laws, really a series of improvisations grounded in the Redeemer's teachings. In every instance, private property was anathematized, and everyone labored for the community, which is to say, for God. But each sect varied in its rules governing sex and family life. As a general principle, they regarded marriage and cohabitation as a threat to the collectivity. Father Rapp strictly forbade sex, though he could not always prevent it. Children were continually being born at Harmony. The other colonies, though disapproving of sex, were more or less lax in exorcising it. Their aversion to sex and marriage may have been justified, for a rough correlation can be drawn between asceticism and prosperity in the religious communities. Those that succeeded best, namely the Shakers and the Rabbits, were the most emphatic in renouncing conventional marriage. The individual family unit turned out to be a far more divisive force than private property. In trying to hold on to their integrity, the foreign communities had more to worry about than did the Shakers, who at least knew how to deal with their fellow countrymen. They knew, that is, how much of the world they could bear, and how deeply to withdraw into themselves the moment they felt their faith threatened. This knowledge enabled the Shakers to flourish inside the belly of Leviathan, near the crowded cities and well-settled countryside. The foreign sects, however, needed to preserve a physical distance from their neighbors, moreover, who tended to be tolerant, even friendly. Toleration, which brought the sect into closer touch with the world, sometimes led to a weakening of the faith, then to a questioning of sanctified authority, then to disobedience, finally apostasy. In response, the foreign prophets sometimes found it necessary to take drastic measures, to give up everything. The Fruits of Lord Byron was amused by Father Rapp. He wrote the following lines in Canto XV of Ungoi. When Rapp the harmonist embargoed marriage, in his harmonious settlement which flourishes, strangely enough as yet without miscarriage, because it breeds no more mouths than it nourishes, without those sad expenses which disparage what nature most encourages. Why called he harmony a state sans wedlock? Now here I've got the preacher at a deadlock, because he either meant to sneer at harmony or marriage, by divorcing them thus oddly. But whether Reverend Rapp learned this in Germany or not, 'tis said his sect is rich and godly, pious and pure, beyond what I can term any D.F. Debs. As we shall see, the Oneida perfectionists, who were militantly anti-celibate, did quite well too, but they did have this in common with the Shakers and Rabbits. They abolished the family unit. Years of toil, and returned to the wilderness in the hope of reenacting the original thaumaturgic experience. Twice Father Rapp and his charges pulled up stakes and abandoned their thriving, well-managed little communities. In 1814 they left Harmony, Pennsylvania, to found Harmony, Indiana. 10 years later they sold the second Harmony to Robert Owen and settled, this time for good, in western Pennsylvania. The true inspirationists, 12 years after building up Ebenezer, moved to central Iowa, where, once again they made a trackless waste flower with abundance. The most unusual expedition was undertaken by William Kyle. After its establishment in 1844, his community of Bethel prospered. By the mid-1850s it contained more than 1,000 inhabitants. It was then that he decided to go to the Oregon Territory, which had recently opened up, at the head of several hundred Bethelites. While preparing for the trip, his son and heir apparent died of malaria. Kyle had promised the boy before his death that he would take him to Oregon, come what may. Keeping his promise, he placed the coffin in the lead wagon. For weeks a great funeral cortege of wagons slowly made the trek northward across the silent, unexplored regions of the country. En route, the faithful sang a dirge that Kyle had composed in memory of his son, Das Grab is tief und still. Within months after their arrival in Oregon, the Bethelites had wrested a community from the forests, and they named it Aurora to herald the coming of the new day. Kyle remained in Aurora and governed far-off Bethel through his assistants. Both the Shakers and the foreign sects came out of revivalist movements. So did the Oneida Perfectionist Society, the last and probably most famous of the millenarian groups to plant a colony in America. The history of perfectionism coincides with the biography of its founder, John Humphrey Noyes. He conceived it, built it, ran it, and oversaw its dissolution. Noyes was born in Putney, Vermont, in 1811, one of many children of a prominent New England family on both sides. At the age of 20, just after graduating from Dartmouth, he was converted by the revivalist, John Finney. A social as well as religious crusade, the Finney revival fueled some of the radical causes, notably anti-Masonism, Barnbummer, democracy, and abolitionism, that flared up in western New England and central New York. Finney himself was an abolitionist, and so for a while was Noyes. Noyes studied divinity at Andover and Yale, but he found himself deviating further and further from established Calvinist doctrines. When he publicly denied original sin and the need for visible churches, recognizing only purity of heart and the answer of a good conscience toward God, his superiors withdrew his teaching license. For a decade or so he traveled extensively, read widely, and reflected at length on how man can attain spiritual and material perfection, meaning how man can return to the Garden of Eden. At a time of gravely unsettling economic conditions and mounting social discontent, he was determined to find a way of replacing the sin system, the marriage system, the work system, and the death system. In due course, he came to the conclusion that mankind progressed through 4 grades of experience, corresponding to 4 historical epochs: the natural state, or the age of prelapsarian freedom; the legal state, or the age of Jewish covenant; the spiritual state, or the age of Christ's brief sojourn among men; and last, the glorified state, or the age of Christ's freedom, this time forever, an age marked by the abolition of pain and death and of all the principalities of the world. To Noyes was revealed the means of bringing about the glorified state. At Putney, he gathered together a small number of acolytes, recruited mainly from his own and his wife's families. Having established the nucleus of a new religion, Noyes in 1846 proceeded to put his perfectionist theories into effect, in other words, to organize a community. He and his followers surrendered their wealth to a central fund, and, as far as feasible, since some of them still had obligations in the world, worked in concert according to a rational division of labor. They simultaneously submitted to the practice of complex marriage. For years Noyes had been objecting to conventional marriage and family life. Like Mother Ann and other millenarians, he felt that marriage, the consequence of original sin, gave rise to divisiveness, jealousy, and the sexual and economic domination of men over women. But Noyes prescribed the opposite of celibacy. Complex marriage meant the sexual love of every adult male for every adult female in the community. It was to be consummated through a lovemaking technique that Noyes invented, which he called male continence. This technique taught men to hold back their seed during coitus, enabling them to engage in amative love indefinitely. Amative love, according to Noyes's reading of Scripture, was the first and noblest of the social affections, because it was 28. Socialism in America, the love of Adam and Eve before their fall. Afterwards, it became subordinate to the propagative function, lovemaking for the sake of conceiving children. Complex marriage, then, would restore the original order of these two forms of sexuality. Conceiving would be secondary to amative love, the proof of man's freedom from sin, the mark of his habitation in the glorified state. It was not long before the people of Putney learned of the outrageous experiments being carried out by the little group of perfectionists. Noyes was accused of promoting wild orgies in his house, of indulging in free love and promiscuity and even incest. What the good people of Putney did not realize, how could they? Was that free love in the commonly accepted meaning of the term, namely spontaneous, uninhibited, completely natural sexuality, void of consequences and obligations, was furthest from the minds of the perfectionist. The choice of partners, the purpose of lovemaking, amative or procreative, these and other considerations had to be worked out collectively. At least on the part of the male, continence demanded the renunciation of pleasure. Love among the perfectionists was hardly free. In 1848 Noyes and his followers moved from inhospitable Putney to Oneida, in central New York, where a few of his converts lived. Within a year of their settlement they had laid the foundation of a Bible communist society at Oneida. They had put up a 4-story build MG to house themselves and their children, 50 residents in all, and had cleared the ground for cultivation. There was as yet no definite division of labor, and the women took their places alongside the men, often performing the same work. In doing so, the women assumed simple, unaffected modes of dress and appearance. The outside world would have been as scandalized by their functional clothes, they wore bloomers and slacks, and short hair, as by their sexual practices. Though the perfectionists worked long hours and cut their expenses to the bone, Oneida in its first few years kept losing money. The reason was obvious to Noyes. The community was too dependent on agriculture. To survive it would have to turn to manufacturing. In fact, Oneida's fortunes did change for the better when it began to produce steel traps of excellent quality. The success of this venture persuaded Noyes to establish other profitable enterprises, e.g., sewing silk, preserved fruit, and above all silver cutlery. Though Oneida's population had increased five-fold by 1855, there was more than enough work for everyone. By then Oneida had taken on the aspect of a prosperous, exceedingly well-managed capitalist corporation. It was not a capitalist corporation, however, because its purpose was to transcend worldly goods, not accumulate them, to liberate men from the tortures of original sin, not reinforce them. The perfectionists worked short hours, by mid-19th century standards, and spent the bulk of their time in communal activities, playing, reading, conversing, confessing, of which more later, worshipping, and love-making. They avoided specialization, the bane of the communitarian ethic, and rotated from job to job and, since they had to be administrators too, from office to office. Oneida's educational system pointed out the extent of its difference from the outside world. It regarded children not as creatures, refractory and disobedient by nature, who had to be broken before they could be taught, but as sinless and potentially perfect. Corporal punishment played no part in Oneida pedagogy. Children over 3 were brought up by the community and were encouraged to discover and pursue their own desires. Oneida, then, was far less austere than the other religious sects. It felt less menaced, less beleaguered. Not only did it trade extensively with the outside, it hired workers from the outside to do some of the menial chores, and it sent some members, mostly students, to outside trade schools. Compared to the other religious communities, Oneida was open and free in its relations with the world at large. Noyes and his coadjutors had their devices for holding the society together. A fearful method of confessions known as mutual criticism kept incipient backsliders to the mark. When a member was charged with wrongdoing, or fell under suspicion, a committee interrogated him until it was satisfied that his guilt had been laid bare and expiated. In serious cases, the whole community would assemble, and Noyes himself would lead the session. How effective mutual criticism was can be gauged by this description of a newcomer's first encounter with it. Every trait of my character that I took any pride or comfort in seemed to be cruelly discounted, and after, as it were, being tumbed inside out and thoroughly inspected, I was, metaphorically, stood upon my head, and allowed to drain till all the self-righteousness had dripped out of me. For days in 30. Socialism in America, weeks after I found myself recalling various passages of my criticism and reviewing them in a new light, the more I pondered, the more convinced I became of the justice of what at first my spirit had so violently rebelled against. Today I feel that I would give many years of my life if I could have just one more criticism from John H. Noyes. With the rise of the Oneida community in the late 1850s, American religious communism reached its apogee. By then there were about 45 sectarian colonies, including 18 Shaker and 2 Perfectionist. The other was at Wallingford, Connecticut, scattered across the country from the Berkshires to the Pacific, and embracing almost 9,000 people. By this time, too, the colonies were no longer considered perverse and strange. They had in fact gained a large measure of respectability. Society in general, at least the well-informed portion of it, had become familiar with their works and in some instances with their doctrines. But the high point of millenarian communism was also the beginning of its demise. In an age of advancing industrialism and secularism, self-sufficient religious sects were increasingly anachronistic. The great revival movements that had periodically stoked the fires of millenarianism here and abroad died out in the course of the 19th century. And such revivalisms as did take place appealed to individuals rather than to whole communities. They sought to rescue souls rather than bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth. And so the sects atrophied as the older members died. Except for the Shakers, the death of their prophet founders left them moribund, though often it was some time before the communities gave up the ghost. George Rapp died in 1847. The few survivors in economy dissolved their ancient ties in 1905. The Zor community came to an end in 1898, nearly a half-century after the death of its leader. The true inspirationists of Amana, Iowa, held out until the 19,203. The Shakers held out longer, and at the moment this is being written, several of them, all quite old, still live. The other sects scarcely survived their leaders. The Jansenites broke up in 1857, 7 years after Eric Jansen was slain. And Bethel and Aurora quietly expired less than 5 years after William Kyle died. John Humphrey Noyes, who died in 1886, lived long enough to see his perfectionist experiment tumble into a joint stock company. The Shakers, Calvin Green and Seth Y. Wells, A Summary View of the Millennial Church or United Society of Believers * 1848. This classic account of the Shaker religion, written by 2 elders of the New Lebanon Church, was first published in 1808. It went through many editions. Introductory remarks, comprising a short review of the formation of associations and communities. 1. The present age of the world is an age of wonders. The most extraordinary changes, revolutions and remarkable events are rapidly rolling on, through the physical, moral and religious world, that were ever known on Earth. These premises, we believe, will generally be admitted. It appears to be the prevailing sentiment and expectation among nearly all ranks and orders of people, that something wonderful is about to take place. That there will be such a revolution of public sentiment, and such a reformation will be effected in the various branches of human economy as never has been exhibited in the world since the creation of man. 2. These expectations are evidently effected by the operations of divine providence upon the hearts of the people, and are manifestly the precursors and signals of coming events. These events can be truly understood in no other light than as allusions to the period of Christ's second coming. The general expectations of the near approach of a divine ruler and teacher called the Messiah, which prevailed among the Jews, and more or less among other nations, about the time that Jesus Christ came into the world, were also *pp. 1-3, 58-60, 68, Go 93, 260-266. The effects of the same overruling providence. These two events are the most important to mankind of any that have ever taken place on earth, and will yet appear so to all people, whether they believe it or not. 3. The events relating to Christ's second appearance, of which we are more particularly to treat in this volume, are rapidly progressing towards their accomplishment, in many and various ways. But among all the hopeful expectations, labors and desires of mankind, in the present age, none appear more evident than those which lead to the formation of associations in which all the members can enjoy equal rights and privileges, physical and moral, both of a spiritual and temporal nature, in a united capacity. Many have become fully convinced that this is the ultimate destiny of mankind, and that they never can enjoy that happiness for which their Creator designed them, in any other way than in such united capacity. This is true, but this united capacity must be built on the true foundation, which is nothing less than divine revelation, or it cannot stand. 4. Some of the greatest pursuits of the age appear to be directed to these communities. They have their combined associations for almost every kind of improvement, whether of a religious, moral or physical nature. Yet to attain this desirable object, and support it in its true order, they have not the power. In this they are greatly deficient. The great inequality of rights and privileges which prevails so extensively throughout the world is a striking evidence of the importance of a reformation of some kind. Who can view the unequal state of human society, the overgrown wealth of the few, and the abject poverty of the many, and not be convinced of this? Surely it is too obvious to escape the notice of any rational mind. A4-5. To see the luxurious state of the pampered rich, the oppression and destitution of the poor, who are perishing by thousands, yea, hundreds of thousands, for the want of the necessaries of life, and the consequent bitter animosities and increasing collisions between the rich and the poor, must suggest to every benevolent mind the indispensable necessity of some system of operation among men, that will confer a much greater equality of rights and underscore privileges, both in person and property, than any which now prevails, in order to prevent mankind from rushing on to utter ruin. Pf. equals. Religious Communitarians 33-6. Multitudes of people have been so firmly persuaded of the utility and practicability of such a system, that they have attempted to form communities upon the plan of equal rights and privileges, with a unity of interest in all things, believing that it is the design of the benevolent Creator that man should be a social and benevolent being. That their joys and sorrows, as fellow beings, may be shared together. These sentiments are evidently the impressions of divine goodness, and clearly show his benevolent designs for his creature man, who is his intelligent representative in this lower world. This was prefigured under the law, when divine providence fed the people of Israel with manna. Of this they all shared equally, according to their necessities. T7. During the present century, many attempts have been made to form associations upon the plan of a community of interest, in various parts of Europe and in the United States of America. Many societies have been formed in part or wholly upon this plan. But it is well known that with all their wisdom, skill, benevolent designs, unity of intention, convenience of location and confidence of success, they have soon failed in their expectations, and been scattered as before. This signal and general failure has more or less disappointed the votaries of this system, and set many to devising some other plan to accomplish their object. Many, of course, scoff at the idea of such communities, while others, after having tried the system, have given up the object as unattainable. 8. But notwithstanding these general failures, we are prepared to show that there is a sure system, founded upon the principles of a unity of interest in all things, which has stood the test a sufficient length of time, to prove that it can be attained and supported. This system has been established and maintained for many years, in 7 different states in this Union, and in many locations in these states. G. The United Society of Believers, called Shakers, was founded upon the principles of equal rights and privileges, with a united interest in all things, both spiritual and temporal, and has been maintained and supported in this society, at New Lebanon, about 60 years, without the least appearance of any failure. Is not this proof sufficient in favor of such a system? WRE. 10 euros. We believe it will generally be granted that no institution, 1 exit, XVI, 4 to 18. 34. Socialism in America, either social or religious, ever founded on earth, has, in any age of the world, stood half a century without a manifest declension in the general virtue of its principles, and the integrity of its members, however extensive and durable may have been its name and popularity of character. 11. But this united society, though formed of characters, views and dispositions of all kinds that can be named, of various nations, of rich and poor, bond and free, male and female, has maintained its primitive institution and the integrity of its first principles, with a continued increase of the same to this day. And although it has founded and established branches in various states of the Union, where the laws and customs of the people vary, it has not failed in its ability to maintain its institutions and the purity of its religious principles in a single instance. Para. I. The established order and religious practice of the United Society. Chapter I. Formation of the society into a united body, possessing a consecrated interest. 1. As the manner of God's work, both in the natural and spiritual creation, has always been progressive, increasing from one degree of order to another until it arrives to perfection, so the order which has been established in the Church of Christ on earth was necessarily progressive, being effected by the progressive operations of His divine Spirit in the hearts of the faithful. While the believers, as a people, remained in their respective natural families, scattered about in different places, possessing respectively the temporal interest inherited by natural heirship, or acquired by their own labors in their respective callings, there could not be much order among two if individuals who have belonged to these societies have violated their religious faith and principles, and refused to reform. They have been obliged to depart, because no violation of virtuous principles can be tolerated among us. Religious communitarians 35 them, accepting the common order of nature. But all who had honestly confessed and forsaken their sins, and faithfully continued to take up their crosses, according to the manifestation of the gift of God which they had received, who had paid all their just debts, and freed themselves from all outward embarrassments, and by their faithfulness and obedience, had gained a sufficient degree of mortification to the fallen nature of the flesh, were thereby prepared for a further increase of gospel order. To gain this increase, it was necessary that they should be brought into a nearer connection together, and thereby be enabled to serve God in a more united capacity, as members of the body of Christ in a church relation. 2. To constitute a true Church of Christ, there must necessarily be a union of faith, of motives and of interest, in all the members who compose it. There must be one body and one bread, registered, and nothing short of this union in all things, both spiritual and temporal, can constitute a true church, which is the body of Christ. And wherever that united body exists, it will bring into operation every individual talent for the general good of the whole body. And herein is the prayer of Jesus answered, that they may be one, even as we are one. In this united capacity, the strength of the whole body becomes the strength of each member. And being united in the one Spirit of Christ, they have a greater privilege to serve God than they possibly could have in a separate capacity, and are better able to be mutual helps to each other. And they also find a greater degree of protection from the snares of a selfish and worldly nature. 3. The way having been gradually prepared for the attainment of this important object, particularly by the ministration of Father James, it now began to take place under the ministration of Father Joseph and Mother Lucy. The first step was to gather the believers into a body, where they could enjoy all things in common, both of a spiritual and temporal kind, and in which their temporal interest could be united together, and be consecrated to religious purposes. This proceeding, being dictated by divine wisdom, was a matter of free choice to every individual, for no one was compelled to give up his interest contrary to his own faith and inward feelings. But all who had faithfully kept pace with the work of God, in its increase thus far, and had been able to settle their $1 core X. 17. 4 John XVII, 22. 36. Socialism in America. Temporal concerns were prepared for it, and esteemed it a special privilege to be admitted into that united body, and be numbered with the most faithful. But the permanent establishment of order was necessarily a progressive work, and could not be suddenly accomplished. 4. The gathering of the society began at New Lebanon, in the month of September, 1787, and continued to progress as fast as circumstances and the nature of the work would admit. Elders and deacons were appointed to lead and direct in matters of spiritual and temporal concern. Suitable buildings were erected for the accommodation of the members, and order and regularity were, by degrees, established in the society, so that in the year 1792, the Church was considered as established in the principles of her present order and spirit of government. Those who were thus gathered into a united body were denominated the Church, being a collective body of Christians separated from the world, and enjoying in their united capacity one common interest. In this situation they were enabled to gain a greater degree of victory over the nature of selfishness, and thus to subdue more effectually the evil propensities of a carnal nature. By this means they found a greater degree of mortification and death to the nature of sin, and experienced a gradual growth in love and union, peace and harmony, and all those heavenly graces which Adam the man of God, and render him perfect in every good word and work. 11. In every society, Elders are appointed and established in each large family, consisting, generally, of 2 persons of each sex. These are considered as the head of the family. They are required to be persons of blameless character, well approved for faithfulness, integrity and stability of soul, and gifted in wisdom and spiritual administration. As faithful watchmen upon the walls of Zion, it becomes their duty to watch over their respective families, to teach, exhort and lead in spiritual consums. 12. The management of temporal concerns, in such families, is entrusted to the deacons and deaconesses, as trustees of the temporal property of the society or family to which they belong. To these pertain the duties of providing for the support and convenience of their respective families, of regulating the various branches of business in which the members are employed, and of transacting business with those without. Religious communitarians 37 according to their several abilities, to maintain one united interest. And therefore all labor with their hands, in some useful occupation, for the mutual comfort and benefit of themselves and each other, and for the general good of the society or family to which they belong. Ministers, elders and deacons, all without exception, are industriously employed in some manual occupation, except in the time taken up in the necessary duties of their respective callings. 13. Thus all are faithful, cheerful and happy in the conscientious performance of their respective duties, and such is the spirit of industry that pervades the whole society, that an idle, lazy person will not long abide in it. And this is effected by no other coercive power than the force of conscience, and the spirit which prevails throughout the society. For none are required to labor beyond their strength and abilities, and each one must act conscientiously in this, as I am all other duties. If reproof or admonition is at any time found necessary, it must be applied through the medium of the conscience, for the law of Christ admits of no external compulsion. But none can be allowed to remain in the society, who maintain disobedience to its established faith and principles. 14. No selfish or party feelings can have any sway in the Church of Christ, for the whole power of government being founded in the law of Christ, and supported by the union of the members, any power, authority or influence, which has any tendency to produce disunion, contrary to that law, is necessarily excluded from any participation in the government. In short, the whole government of the Church is effected, and all its important concerns are regulated and maintained, by the spontaneous union and subjection of all the faithful to the law of Christ, established in the Church. 22. Therefore they shall come and sing in the height of Zion, and shall flow together to the goodness of the Lord. Then shall the virgin rejoice in the dance, both young men and old together. For I will turn their mourning into joy, and will comfort them, and make them rejoice from their sorrow. And I will satiate the soul of the priests with fatness, and my people shall be satisfied with my goodness, saith the Lord. 23. What can be more plain and clear to the point than these declarations of the prophet? What words could describe with more certainty, not only the fullness of joy, comfort and satisfaction of those who should come into this plain and perfect way, but also 38. Socialism in America, the divine exercises, and very manner of worship in which they would be engaged. The term virgin signifies purity, and this prediction of the prophet was evidently intended to imply that those who should be called to this glorious work, and enjoy these blessed privileges, must be a pure people. Hence, both young men and old, being characterized by the title virgin, must possess purity of heart, and live a virgin life. Registered 24. We are aware that a strong prejudice prevails against the exercise of dancing, as an act of divine worship, in consequence of its having been, for many ages, perverted to the service of the wicked. Hence, it is considered by many as, at best, but a vain recreation, much more calculated to gratify the levity of giddy, thoughtless mortals, and to divert the mind from sober reflections, than to enliven the devotional feelings of the heart, and promote the solid enjoyments of the Christian. Therefore they judge it altogether unreasonable and inconsistent to suppose it can be acceptable to God as an act of divine worship. But we would seriously ask whether the same objections will not operate, still more forcibly, against singing, as an act of divine worship. 25. It is a well-known fact, that every created talent, pertaining to fallen man, which was designed for the service of God, has been perverted and abused to vain, foolish and wicked purposes, and perhaps none more generally so than that of singing. Music, unconnected with dancing, is doubtless much more generally used, as an amusement of the wicked. Besides, as it is the very life of dancing, it must, at least, be equally reprehensible in that view alone. But this is not all. The talents of poetry and music, exclusive of their connection with dancing, are still far more abused by being devoted to base purposes. 26. Is there a single base passion or evil propensity, in human nature, which has not been more or less excited, indulged and gratified by means of poetical and musical compositions? How often have the angry passions been roused by war songs, and urged mankind to mutual butchery, blood and slaughter? How often have the five? It is the prevailing opinion that this prophecy alluded to the return of the Jews from Babylon. But admitting that the prophecy had a literal allusion to that event, yet their return was but a figure of the restoration of the true church, and as the character of the Jews was by no means answerable to the title of the Virgin, therefore the true spirit of that prophecy could not be fulfilled in them, its teal accomplishment must be in the Virgin Church of Christ. Lascivious passions been excited and indulged by obscene songs. How often is morality set at naught, and piety and religion abused, yea, and the name of God and all sacred things blasphemed by the wicked, in their profane songs. How often has vice been exalted, and virtue depressed, yea, how often has the virtuous mind been robbed of its innocence, and villainy emboldened in crimes, by songs calculated and used for those very purposes. Do not the revels of drunkards and profane swearers often owe their excesses to their bacchanalian songs, as well as to their bottles? 27. In short, have not thefts, robberies and murders, and indeed every species of villainy, been much more excited and encouraged by music than by dancing? And yet music has been encouraged and practiced, as a part of divine worship, by nearly all denominations, while dancing has been condemned and excluded. But upon what principle? Why truly upon this: that dancing cannot be an acceptable mode of worship, because it is practiced in the carnal recreations of the wicked. Thus man assumes the right of deciding in what manner God shall be worshipped. But will God acknowledge such a decision as this? And must the followers of Christ, in compliance with this decision, bury a portion of their talents in the earth, which were given for the service of God, because the wicked have profanely abused such like talents, in the service of the devil? Does such a decision appear honorable to the wisdom of man, even upon the supposition that he has a right to decide in what manner God shall be worshipped? Is it not rather a glaring evidence of the total insufficiency of human sagacity to regulate those things which belong to divine wisdom? 28. God has created man an active, intelligent being, possessing important powers and faculties, capable of serving himself according to his needs and circumstances, and he is required to devote these powers and faculties to the service of God. To devote only a part to the service of God is to render an imperfect service, which God never will accept. Man is required to love God with all his heart, soul, mind and strength. Every faculty must therefore be devoted to the love of God, but it is in vain to talk of loving God with all the faculties, without serving him with all the faculties. For no man who truly loves God with all his faculties, can refrain from devoting all to his service, and he who is unwilling to devote all to the service of God, can never devote all to his love. 40. Socialism in America. Party VA. Chapter IV. The manifestation of Christ in the female. 7. The many instances recorded in the sacred writings prove beyond dispute, that in past ages, God did condescend to reveal his mind and will to females, who were then commissioned, by divine authority, to bear testimony thereof to man. And the two signal instances of deliverance effected through the instrumentality of Deborah and Esther are sufficient to show that God did, on each of these extraordinary occasions, raise up and empower a female to accomplish an extraordinary deliverance, which was beyond the power of man to effect without their assistance. 8. If then, God has, in these last days, raised up a female to reveal the true testimony and spirit of Christ, and endowed her with power to effect the deliverance of lost man from the bondage of sin, and to usher in the latter day of glory, shall man reject the work on that account? Is it too debasing to the pride and haughtiness of fallen man? If so, let it be remembered that, the Lord of hosts hath purposed it, to stain the pride of all glory, and to bring into contempt all the honorable of the earth. And the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men shall be made low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Register G. It is well known that when souls come to be awakened to a feeling sense of their need of salvation, their general cry is, "What shall we do to be saved? Lord, send by whom thou wilt send. Work by means of thy own choosing. Only show us thy will. Bring us salvation from the bondage of sin." It is on these conditions we are willing to receive Christ, though revealed in a manner contrary to every feeling of a fallen nature. We are determined to exalt the Lord alone, to know none but Christ, wherever manifested and in whomsoever found, and to bear the cross, though it crucify us to the world, and the world to us. 10. Although it was necessary that the Spirit of Christ should be manifested in both male and female, yet no man nor woman that ever appeared on earth could ever be a proper object of divine worship. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. God is therefore the only proper object of divine worship, and no one can ever worship in the spiritual work of God, unless called and directed by the Spirit of Christ. For according to his own testimony, no man cometh unto the Father but by me. 8. Therefore no man can worship God, but through Christ, and the only true worship that we can render to God, is to honor and glorify him by yielding obedience to his will. And though a portion of the Spirit of Christ must be in every soul, in order to unite them to his body, yet the manifestation of the will of God for the guide and direction of souls, in his true spiritual work, must be revealed in the order of God's appointment, through those witnesses whom he sends for that purpose. 11. As the divine Spirit and will of God, in these last days, has been manifested in Christ, through the two first messengers of salvation, so the same Spirit continues to manifest his will, through the same line and order, in the Church of Christ, and will ever continue so to do, as long as Christ shall continue to have a true church on earth. Therefore, as the ancients worshipped the God of their fathers, so worship we that God who has been revealed to us by our spiritual parents in the gospel, whom God hath raised up and sent to open the way of salvation to us. We worship neither man nor woman, but we honor and obey the Spirit of Christ, whether revealed in man, woman or child. 12. The natural creation, and the things therein contained, are figurative representations of the spiritual creation which is to supersede it, as we have already shown. The first parents of the natural world were created male and female. The man was first in his creation, and the woman was afterwards taken from his substance, and placed in her proper order to be the second in the government and dominion of the natural world, and the order of man's creation was not complete till this was done. For it must be acknowledged by all, that without male and female, the perfection of man, the term here translated word, properly signifies, in the original, divine intelligence, or mind of power and wisdom. For in this mind, which is true Christ, God is revealed to us. C1. Cor. E. 16. A natural creation must have been less complete than that of the inferior part of the creation, which was evidently created male and female. Hence it must appear obvious, that in the spiritual creation, man and woman, when raised from a natural to a spiritual state, must still be male and female. For the spiritual state of man, which is substantial and eternal, cannot be less perfect in its order, than his natural state, which is but temporal and figurative of the spiritual. 13. As the true Church of Christ, which is his body, is composed of male and female, as its members, and as there must be a correspondent spiritual union between the male and female, to render the Church complete, as a spiritual body, so it is essentially necessary that such a spiritual union should exist in the head of that body, which is Christ. Otherwise there could be no source from which such a correspondent, spiritual union could flow to the body. It must be admitted by every reasonable person, that the order of man cannot be complete without the woman. If so, then the Church cannot exist, in its proper order, without male and female members. For, neither is the man without the woman, nor the woman without the man, in the Lord. Degree, and it would be very unreasonable to suppose that the body of Christ should be more complete and perfect in its order than the head. This would give the body a superiority over the head. 14. This spiritual union between the male and female, in the body and in the head of the Church, is that which the Apostle calls a great mystery. And indeed it is a great mystery to the lost children of men, who seem to have no conception of any other union between the male and female, than that which is natural, according to the order of the flesh. Nor do they seem to know any other design in the creation of the female, nor any other essential use for her than that of carnal enjoyment in a sexual union, and the production of offspring through that medium. But the work of Christ, being a spiritual work, the union must therefore be spiritual. And it is impossible for souls to come into this work, and enjoy this union, unless the Spirit of Christ becomes their life. 15. Since, then, Christ must appear in every female, as well as in every male, before they can be saved, and since that divine Spirit has appeared in one man, whom God hath chosen as the captain 101 Cor. She. 11. 42 EPH, v. 32. Of our salvation, and an example of righteousness to all men, is it not reasonable and consistent that the same anointing power, which is Christ, should also appear in a woman, and distinguish her as a leader, and an example of righteousness to all women? 16. It may be asked, how can Christ appear in a woman? With the same propriety we might ask, how can Christ appear in a man? Christ is a spirit. The Lord is that Spirit. 22. In that Spirit is contained the only power of salvation. If Christ could not appear in a man, then no man could be saved, so also, if Christ could not appear in a woman, then no woman could be saved. Christ first appeared in Jesus of Nazareth, as the bridegroom, by which he was constituted the head and father of the new and spiritual creation of God. The Spirit of Christ was in the primitive church, and the Spirit of Christ is also in every one of his true and faithful followers. The Spirit of Christ is the same, in substance, whether revealed in man, woman or child, but in different orders. 17. It may perhaps be urged, by way of objection, that if a female was to be raised up, to stand in a correspondent connection with the firstborn Son of God, in order to usher in the latter day of glory, and bring about the regeneration of a lost world, it would appear reasonable that she also, as well as he, should have been brought forth by a miraculous birth. But a little reflection will show the impropriety of this. Such a birth would not have corresponded with the figure given in the creation of the first man and woman. Adam was called the figure of him that was to come. He had a miraculous creation, being formed out of the dust of the earth, and was the Son of God in the natural and figurative creation. See Luke e. 38. Jesus had also a miraculous birth, being born of a virgin, without the cooperation of man, and being the agent of the divine intelligence, became the Son of God in the divine order. See John I. 14. But this virgin, being a natural woman, a daughter of Adam, her body was of the earth. And in this sense, she was as the dust of the earth, though, in its highest state of natural perfection under the fall, as was needful it should be, when designed for such an extraordinary purpose. 18. Eve, who was the figure of her that was to come, was not created out of the dust of the earth, as Adam was, but was formed of his substance, and taken from his body. Therefore she was de 122 cor. E. 17. 13 Rom. Version 14. 44. Socialism in America pendant on him, and it was her duty to be subject to him as her head and lord. Had the woman been created in the same manner that the man was, there would have been two separate heads of the creation. And as neither of them could have had the preeminence, as to the origin of their creation, so neither of them could thereby have been placed in a state of subordination to the other. So also, agreeable to this figure, the second Eve was not brought forth in the same manner that the second Adam was. But, as to her person, she came into the world as all women do. But as the substance of the first woman was taken from the body of the first man, so that divine spirit with which the second woman was endowed, and which constituted her the second Eve, and the mother of the new creation, was taken from the divine spirit of the second Adam, the Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore she was necessarily dependent on him, was subject to him, and always acknowledged him as her head and Lord. 19. It was absolutely necessary that the human tabernacle, soul and body, of Jesus Christ, should not only be created in a supernatural manner, by the divine agency of the eternal Father in Moruer, but also in a state superior to that of the first Adam. Otherwise he could never have had the preeminence, as to the superiority of his ongen. As no stream can rise higher than its fountain, so no being could proceed by natural generation, from the loins of Adam, with a life superior to that which he possessed. For he was formed of the elements of temporal life, and not of the elements of eternal life. Therefore, had Jesus been begotten of the seed of Adam, his life could not have been superior to the life of Adam, nor could he have been the medium of superior power. Hence he could not have been the first to possess eternal life, and therefore the source of eternal life could not have been in him. Consequently it could not have been brought to light by him. 20. But Jesus being created in an order superior to that of the first Adam, he was the first to receive the elements of eternal. 14. Had Adam been formed of the elements of eternal life, he could not have died. For that which is eternal can never die. But when God spake to Adam concerning the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he said, In the day thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. This was fulfilled. This shows the absurdity of the idea, that Jesus Christ came into the world for no higher purpose than to raise man to the state from whence Adam fell. His work was to overcome the death of the fall, and rise out of the life and order of nature, into eternal life, and heavenly order, and his spirit will effect the same in his followers, or children. See Heb. Lit. Tea as life from his eternal parents. His divine creation and superior order was announced by the message of the angel to Mary. The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Registered here was plainly manifested the operation of the ERRRNAT2, the Hiccuser and the Holy Spire, by whom the Holy Child Jesus was created, in whom the Son of God was revealed, and eternal life was brought to light. 1 Registered he was doubtless the superior production of human nature, and possessed the greatest natural powers. How else could he have been the head of the human race? This is evident from his temptations on the mount, for the temptation could not have been disproportioned to the capacities of his creation. It is further evidenced by his own words. Behold, a greater than Solomon is here. He was created in a manner and order which showed that in him the works and order of natural generation ceased, and a new and spiritual creation, not according to the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, should begin. 21. Let it be here understood that Christ is a divine spirit, and the man Jesus was not constituted the Christ, or the real Messiah, until anointed of God, and put in full possession of that Spirit which, at his baptism, descended upon and abode with him, in form of a dove. This heavenly dove was the real Christ, the Son of God. 17 And as the human race, in their fallen and lost state, are composed of male and female, so it is necessary that the Spirit of Christ, in which is the only power of salvation, should be manifested in both male and female, in order to complete the work of regeneration and salvation. 15 Luke I. 35. 16 JT is proper to remark here, that in all languages, the term Holy Ghost is the same as Holy Spirit, and is generally expressed by a substantive in the neuter gender, which, of itself, implies neither male nor female. The application of masculine or feminine terms to the Holy Spirit must depend on its relative manifestations, and its operation in the line of male or female. 17 See John I. 33, 34. 4 months among the Shakers, 1842 to 1843. We do not know who wrote this account. It found its way into the manuscript of 1A. J. MacDonald, who was compiling an enormous study of American communities. MacDonald left his manuscript with John Humphrey Noyes, who included portions of it in his History of American Socialisms. Circumstances that need not be rehearsed induced me to visit the Shaker Society at Watervliet in the winter of 1842-3. Soon after my arrival, I was conducted to the elder whose business it was to deal with inquirers. He was a good-looking old man, with a fine open countenance and a well-formed head, as I could see from its being bald. I found him very intelligent, and soon made known to him my business, which was to learn something about the Shakers and their conditions of receiving members. On my observing that I had seen favorable accounts of their society in the writings of Mr. Owen, Miss Martineau, and other travelers in the United States, he replied, that those who wished to know the Shakers must live with them, and this remark proved to be true. He propounded to me at considerable length their faith, the daily cross they were obliged to take up against the devil in the flesh, and the supreme virtue of a life of celibacy. When he had concluded, I asked if those who wished to join the society were expected to acknowledge a belief in all the articles of their faith. To which he replied, that they were not, for many persons came there to join them, who had never heard their gospel preached. But they were always received, and an opportunity given them of accepting or rejecting it. He then informed me of the conditions under which they received candidates. All newcomers have 1 week's trial, to see how they like, and after that, if they wish to continue they must take up the daily cross, and commence the work of regeneration and salvation, following in the footsteps of Jesus pp. 597 to 601, 603 to 606, 610 to 612. Christ and Mother Ann. My first cross, he informed me, would be to confess all the wicked acts I had ever committed. I asked him if he gave absolution like a Catholic priest. He replied, that God forgave sins and not they, but it was necessary in beginning the work of salvation, to unburden the mind of all its past sins. I thought this confession, demanded of strangers, was a piece of good policy on their part, for it enabled the elder who received the confession to form a tolerable opinion of the individual to be admitted. I agreed, however, before confession to make a week's trial of the place, and was accordingly invited to supper, after which I was shown to the sleeping room specially set apart for new members. I was not left here more than an hour when a small bell rang, and one of the brothers entered the room and invited me to go to the family meeting, where I saw for the first time their mode of worshipping God in the dance. I thought it was an exciting exercise, and I should have been more pleased if they had had instrumental, instead of vocal music. At first my meals were brought to me in my room, but after a few days I was invited to commence the work of regeneration and prepare for confession, that I might associate with the rest of the brothers. On making known my readiness to confess, I was taken to the private confession room, and there recounted a brief history of my past life. This appeared rather to please the elder, and he observed that I had not been very wicked. I replied, no, I had not abounded in acts of crime and debauchery. But the old man, to make sure I was not deceiving him, tried to frighten me, by telling me of individuals who had not made a full confession of their wickedness, and who could find no peace or pleasure until they came back and revealed all. He assured me moreover that no wicked person could continue there long without being found out. I was curious to know how such persons would be detected, so he took me to the window and pointed out the places where Mother Ann had stationed 4 angels to watch over her children, and these angels, he said, always communicated any wickedness done there, or the presence of any wicked person among them. But, he continued, you cannot understand these things. Neither can you believe them, for you have not yet got faith enough. I replied, I cannot see the angels. No, said he, I cannot see them with the eye of sense, but I can see them with the eye of faith. You must labor for faith, and when anything. 48. Socialism in America troubles you that you cannot understand or believe, come to me, and do not express doubts to any of the brethren. The elder then put on my eyes a pair of spiritual golden spectacles, to make me see spiritual things. I instinctively put up my hands to feel them, which made the old gentleman half laugh, and he said, oh, you cannot feel them, they will not incommode you, but will help you to see spiritual things. After this I was permitted to eat with the family and invited to attend their love meetings. I was informed that I had perfect liberty to leave the village whenever I chose to do so, but that I was to receive no pay for my services if I were to leave. I should be provided for, the same as if I were one of the oldest members, with food, clothing and lodgings, according to their rules. Daily routine. The hours of rising were 5 o'clock in the summer and 5:30 in the winter. The family all rose at the toll of the bell, and in less than 10 minutes vacated the bedrooms. The sisters then distributed themselves throughout the rooms, and made up all the beds, putting everything in the most perfect order before breakfast. The brothers proceeded to their various employments, and made a commencement for the day. The cows were milked, and the horses were fed. At 7 o'clock the bell rang for breakfast, but it was 10 minutes after when we went to the tables. The brothers and sisters assembled each by themselves, in rooms appointed for the purpose. And at the sound of a small bell the doors of these rooms opened, and a procession of the family was formed in the hall, each individual being in his or her proper place, as they would be at table. The brothers came first, followed by the sisters, and the whole marched in solemn silence to the dining room. The brothers and sisters took separate tables, on opposite sides of the room. All stood up until each one had arrived at his or her proper place, and then at a signal from the elder at the head of the table, they all knelt down for about 2 minutes, and at another signal they all arose and commenced eating their breakfast. Each individual helped himself, which was easily done, as the tables were so arranged that between every 4 persons there was a supply of every article intended for the meal. At the conclusion they all arose and marched away from the tables in the same manner as they marched to them, and during the time of marching, eating, and re-marching, not one word was spoken, but the most perfect silence was preserved. After breakfast all proceeded immediately to their respective employments, and continued industriously occupied until 10 minutes to 12 o'clock, when the bell announced dinner. Farmers then left the field and mechanics their shops, all washed their hands, and formed procession again, and marched to dinner in the same way as to breakfast. Immediately after dinner they went to work again, having no hour for resting, and continued steady at it until the bell announced supper. At supper the same routine was gone through as at the other meals, and all except the farmers went to work again. The farmers were supposed to be doing what were called chores, which appeared to mean any little odd jobs in and about the stables and barns. At 8 o'clock all work was ended for the day, and the family went to what they called a union meeting. This meeting generally continued 1 hour, and then, at about 9 o'clock, all relighted to bed. Asterisk 3%. The dancing meetings. At 7:30 p.m. on the dancing days, all the members retired to their separate rooms, where they sat in solemn silence, just gazing at the stove, until the silver tones of a small tea bell gave the signal for them to assemble in the large hall. Thither they proceeded in perfect order and solemn silence. Each had on thin dancing shoes, and on entering the door of the hall they walked on tiptoe, and took up their positions as follows. The brothers formed a rank on the right, and the sisters on the left, facing each other, about 5 feet apart. After all were in their proper places the chief elder stepped into the center of the space, and gave an exhortation for about 5 minutes, concluding with an invitation to them all to go forth, old men, young men and maidens, and worship God with all their might in the dance. Accordingly they went forth, the men stripping off their coats and remaining in their shirt sleeves. First they formed a procession and marched around the room at double-quick time, while 4 brothers and 4 sisters stood in the center singing for them. After marching in this manner until they got a little warm, they commenced dancing, and continued it until they were all pretty well tired. During the dance the sisters kept on one side, and the brothers on the other, and not a word was spoken. 50. Socialism in America by any of them. After they appeared to have had enough of this exercise, the elder gave the signal to stop, when immediately each one took his or her place in an oblong circle formed around the room, and all waited to see if anyone had received a gift, that is, an inspiration to do something odd. Then 2 of the sisters would commence whirling round like a top, with their eyes shut, and continued this motion for about 15 minutes, when they suddenly stopped and resumed their places, as steady as if they had never stirred. During the whirl, the members stood round like statues, looking on in solemn silence. A message from Mother Ann. On some occasions when a sister had stopped her whirling, she would say, "I have a communication to make," when the head eldress would step to her side and receive the communication, and then make known the nature of it to the company. The first message I heard was as follows. Mother Ann has sent 2 angels to inform us that a tribe of Indians has been round here 2 days, and want the brothers and sisters to take them in. They are outside the building there, looking in at the windows. I shall never forget how I looked round at the windows, expecting to see the yellow faces, when this announcement was made, but I believe some of the old folks who eyed me, bit their lips and smiled. It caused no alarm to the rest, but the first elder exhorted the brothers to take in the poor spirits and assist them to get salvation. He afterward repeated more of what the angels had said, viz. That the Indians were a savage tribe who had all died before Columbus discovered America, and had been wandering about ever since. Mother Ann wanted them to be received into the meeting tomorrow night. After this we dispersed to our separate bedrooms, with the hope of having a future entertainment from the Indians. Indian orgies. The next dancing night we again assembled in the same manner as before, and went through the marching and dancing as usual. After which the hall doors were opened, and the elder invited the Indians to come in. The doors were soon shut again, and one of the sisters, the same who received the original communication, informed us that she saw Indians all around and among the brothers and sisters. The elder then urged upon the members the duty of taking them in, whereupon 8 or 9 sisters became possessed of the spirits of Indian squaws, and about 6 of the brethren became Indians. Then ensued a regular pow-wow, with whooping and yelling and strange antics, such as would require a Dickens to describe. The sisters and brothers squatted down on the floor together, Indian fashion, and the elders and eldresses endeavored to keep them asunder, telling the men they must be separated from the squaws, and otherwise instructing them in the rules of Shakerism. Some of the Indians then wanted some succotash, which was soon brought them from the kitchen in 2 wooden dishes, and placed on the floor, when they commenced eating it with their fingers. These performances continued till about 10 o'clock, then the chief elder requested the Indians to go away, telling them they would find someone waiting to conduct them to the Shakers in the heavenly world. At this announcement the possessed men and women became themselves again, and all retired to rest. The above was the first exhibition of the kind that I witnessed, but it was a very trifling affair to what I afterward saw. To enable you to understand these scenes, I must give you, as near as I can, the ideas the Shakers have of the other world. As I gathered from conversations with the elder, and from his teaching and preaching at the meetings, it is as follows. Heaven is a Shaker community on a very large scale. Everything in it is spiritual. Jesus Christ is the head elder, and Mother Ann the head eldress. The buildings are large and splendid, being all of white marble. There are large orchards with all kinds of fruit. These are also very large gardens laid out in splendid style, with beautiful rivers flowing through them. But all is spiritual. Outside of this heaven the spirits of the departed wander about on the surface of the earth, which is the Shaker hell, till they are converted to Shakerism. Spirits are sent out from the aforesaid heaven on missionary tours, to preach to the wandering ones until they profess the faith, and then they are admitted into the heavenly community. A day of sweeping and scrubbing. An order was received from Mother Ann that a day should be set apart for purification. 52. Socialism in America Row would be observed as a day for general purification. The brothers must clean their respective workshops, by sweeping the walls, and removing every cobweb from the corners and under their work copyright benches, and wash the floors clean by scrubbing them with sand. By doing this they would remove all the devils and wicked spirits that might be lodging in the different buildings, for where cobwebs and dust were permitted to accumulate, there the evil spirits hide themselves. Mother had sent a message that there were evil spirits lodging about, and she wished them to be removed, and also that those members who had committed any wickedness should confess it, and thus make both outside and inside clean. At early dawn next morning, the work commenced, and clean work was made in every building and room, from the grand hall down to the cowhouse. At 10 o'clock 8 of the brothers, with the elders at their head, commenced their journey of inspection through every field, garden, house, workshop and pig pen, chanting the following rhyme as they passed along. Awake from your slumbers, for the Lord of hosts is going through the land. He will sweep, he will clean his holy sanctuary. Search ye your lamps, read and understand. For the Lord of hosts holds the lamp in his hand. A revival in Hades. During my whole stay with the Shakers a revival was going on among the spirits in the invisible world. Information of it was first received by one of the families in Ohio, through a heavenly messenger. The news of the revival soon spread from Ohio to the families in New York and New England. It was caused as follows. George Washington and most of the Revolutionary Fathers had, by some means, got converted, and were sent out on a mission to preach the gospel to the spirits who were wandering in darkness. Many of the wild Indian tribes were sent by them to the different Shaker communities, to receive instruction in the gospel. One of the tribes came to Watervliet and was taken in, as I have described. At one of the Sunday meetings, when the several families were met for worship, one of the brothers declared himself possessed of the spirit of George Washington, and made a speech informing us that Napoleon and all his generals were present at our meeting, together with many of his own officers, who fought with him in the Revolution. These, as well as many more distinguished personages, were all Shakers in the other world, and had been sent to give information relative to the revival now going on. In a few minutes each of the persons present at the meeting fell to representing some of the great personages alluded to. This revival commenced when I first went there, and during the 4 months I remained, much of the members' time was spent in such performances. It appeared to me that whenever any of the brethren or sisters wanted to have some fun, they got possessed of spirits, and would go to cutting up capers, all of which were tolerated even during the hours of labor, because whatever they chose to do was attributed to the spirits. When they became affected they were conveyed to the elder's room, and sometimes he would have 6 or 7 of them at once. The sisters who gave vent to their frolicsome feelings were of course attended to by the eldress. I might occupy great space if I were to go into the details of these spiritual performances, but there was so much similarity in them, that I must ask the reader to let the above suffice. The Perfectionists. John Humphrey Noyes. Bible Communism 1848. Noyes incorporated parts of Bible Communism, his authoritative work on the perfectionist faith, in his History of American Socialisms. Chapter I. Showing what is properly to be anticipated concerning the coming of the kingdom of heaven and its institutions on earth. Proposition 1. The Bible predicts the coming of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Dan. 244. Isa. 25-6-9. 2. The administration of the will of God in his kingdom on earth will be the same as the administration of his will in heaven. Matt. 6:10. EPH. 1:10. 3. In heaven God reigns over body, soul, and estate, without interference from human governments. Dan. 244. 1 Cor. 15:24-25. Isa. 26-13, 14, and 33-22. 4. The institutions of the kingdom of heaven are of such a nature, that the general disclosure of them in the apostolic age would have been inconsistent with the continuance of the institutions of the world through the times of the Gentiles. They were not, therefore, brought out in detail on the surface of the Bible, but were disclosed verbally by Paul and others, to the interior part of the church, 1 Cor. 2-6. 2 Cor. 12-4. John chapter 16 verses 12, 13. Heb. 9-5. Carter 2. Showing that marriage is not an institution of the kingdom of heaven and must give place to communism. Proposerian 5. In the kingdom of heaven, the institution of marriage, which assigns the exclusive possession of one woman to one man, does not exist. Matt. 22-23-30. Asterisk pp. 623-636. 6. In the kingdom of heaven the intimate union of life and interest, which in the world is limited to pairs, extends through the whole body of believers, i.e. complex marriage takes the place of simple. John chapter 17 verse 21. Christ prayed that all believers might be one, even as he and the Father are one. His unity with the Father is defined in the words, all mine are thine, and all thine are mine. Veer. 10. This perfect community of interests, then, will be the condition of all, when his prayer is answered. The universal unity of the members of Christ is described in the same terms that are used to describe marriage unity. Compare 1 Cor. 12:12-27 with General 2:24. See also 1 Cor. 6:15-17 and EPH 5:30-32. 7. The effects of the effusion of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost present a practical commentary on Christ's prayer for the unity of believers, and a sample of the tendency of heavenly influences, which fully confirm the foregoing proposition. All that believed were together and had all things common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all, as every man had need. The multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. Acts chapter 2 verse 44, 45, and 4:32. Here is unity like that of the Father and the Son. All mine thine, and all thine mine. 8. Admitting that the community principle of the day of Pentecost, in its actual operation at that time, extended only to material goods, yet we affirm that there is no intrinsic difference between property in persons and property in things, and that the same spirit which abolished exclusiveness in regard to money, would abolish, if circumstances allowed full scope to it, exclusiveness in regard to women and children. Paul expressly places property in women and property in goods in the same category, and speaks of them together, as ready to be abolished by the advent of the kingdom of heaven. The time, says he, is short, it remaineth that they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that buy as though they possessed not, for the fashion of this world passeth away. 1 Cor. 7:29-31. 9. The abolishment of appropriation is involved in the very nature of a true relation to Christ in the gospel. This we prove thus. The possessive feeling which expresses itself by the possessive pronoun mine, is the same in essence when it relates to persons, as when it relates to money or any other property. Amativeness and 56. Socialism in America. Acquisitiveness are only different channels of one stream. They converge as we trace them to their source. Grammar will help us to ascertain their common center, for the possessive pronoun mine is derived from the personal pronoun ij, and so the possessive feeling, whether amative or acquisitive, flows from the personal feeling, that is, it is a branch of egotism. Now egotism is abolished by the gospel relation to Christ. The grand mystery of the gospel is vital union with Christ, the merging of self in his life, the extinguishment of the pronoun I at the spiritual center. Thus Paul says, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. The grand distinction between the Christian and the unbeliever, between heaven and the world, is, that in one reigns the we spirit, and in the other the I spirit. From I comes mine, and from the spirit comes exclusive appropriation of money, women, etc. From we comes ours, and from the we spirit comes universal community of interests. 10. The abolishment of exclusiveness is involved in the love relation required between all believers by the express injunction of Christ and the apostles, and by the whole tenor of the New Testament. The new commandment is, that we love one another, and that, not by pairs, as in the world, but en masse. We are required to love one another fervently. The fashion of the world forbids a man and woman who are otherwise appropriated, to love one another fervently. But if they obey Christ they must do this, and whoever would allow them to do this, and yet would forbid them, on any other ground than that of present expediency, to express their unity, would strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. For unity of hearts is as much more important than any external expression of it, as a camel is larger than a gnat. 11. The abolishment of social restrictions is involved in the ontolegality of the gospel. It is incompatible with the state of perfected freedom toward which Paul's gospel of grace without law leads, that man should be allowed and required to love in all directions, and yet be forbidden to express love except in one direction. In fact, Paul says, with direct reference to sexual intercourse, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. 1 Cor. 6:12. thus placing the restrictions which were necessary in the transition period on the basis, not of law, but of expediency in the demands of spiritual freedom, and leaving it fairly to be. Religious communitarians 57 inferred that in the final state, when hostile surroundings and powers of bondage cease, all restrictions also will cease. 12. The abolishment of the marriage system is involved in Paul's doctrine of the end of ordinances. Marriage is one of the ordinances of the worldly sanctuary. This is proved by the fact that it has no place in the resurrection. Paul expressly limits it to life in the flesh. Rom. 7-2, 3. The assumption, therefore, that believers are dead to the world by the death of Christ, which authorized the abolishment of Jewish ordinances, legitimately makes an end of marriage. Col 2:20. 13. The law of marriage is the same in kind with the Jewish law concerning meats and drinks and holy days, of which Paul said that they were contrary to us, and were taken out of the way, being nailed to the cross. Col 2:14. The plea in favor of the worldly social system, that it is not arbitrary, but founded in nature, will not bear investigation. All experience testifies, the theory of the novels to the contrary notwithstanding, that sexual love is not naturally restricted to pairs. Second marriages are contrary to the one love theory, and yet are often the happiest marriages. Men and women find universally, however the fact may be concealed, that their susceptibility to love is not burnt out by one honeymoon, or satisfied by one lover. On the contrary, the secret history of the human heart will bear out the assertion that it is capable of loving any number of times and any number of persons, and that the more it loves the more it can love. This is the law of nature, thrust out of sight and condemned by common consent, and yet secretly known to all. 14. The law of marriage worketh wrath. 1. It provokes to secret adultery, actual or of the heart. 2. It ties together unmatched natures. 3. It sunders matched natures. 4. It gives to sexual appetite only a scanty and monotonous allowance, and so produces the natural vices of poverty, contraction of taste and stinginess or jealousy. 5. It makes no provision for the sexual appetite at the very time when that appetite is the strongest. By the custom of the world, marriage, in the average of cases, takes place at about the age of 24. Whereas puberty commences at the age of 14. For 10 years, therefore, and that in the very flush of life, the sexual appetite is starved. This law of society bears hardest on females, because they have less opportunity of choosing their time of marriage than men. This discrepancy between the marriage system and nature is 10. 58. Socialism in America. The principal sources of the peculiar diseases of women, of prostitution, masturbation, and licentiousness in general. Chapter 2. Showing that death is to be abolished, and that, to this end, there must be a restoration of true relations between the sexes. Proposition 15. The kingdom of heaven is destined to abolish death in this world. Rom. 8:19-25, 1 Cor. 15:24-26. Isa. 25-8. 16. The abolition of death is to be the last triumph of the kingdom of heaven, and the subjection of all other powers to Chanist must go before it. 1 Cor. 15:24-26. Isa. 33:22-24. 17. The restoration of true relations between the sexes is a matter second in importance only to the reconciliation of man to God. The distinction of male and female is that which makes man the image of God, i.e. the image of the Father and the Son. General 127. The relation of male and female was the first social relation. Gen. 222. It is therefore the root of all other social relations. The derangement of this relation was the first result of the original breach with God. General 3-7. Comp. 225. Adam and Eve were, at the beginning, in open, fearless, spiritual fellowship, first with God and secondly, with each other. Their transgression produced two corresponding alienations, viz. First, an alienation from God, indicated by their fear of meeting Him and their hiding themselves among the trees of the garden, and secondly, an alienation from each other, indicated by their shame at their nakedness and their hiding themselves from each other by clothing. These were the two great manifestations of original sin, the only manifestations presented to notice in the record of the apostasy. The first thing then to be done, in an attempt to redeem man and reorganize society, is to bring about reconciliation with God, and the second thing is to bring about a true union of the sexes. In other words, religion is the first subject of interest, and sexual morality the second, in the great enterprise of establishing the kingdom of heaven on earth. 19. From what proceeds, it is evident that any attempt to revolutionize sexual morality before settlement with God is out of order. Holiness must go before free love. Bible communists are not responsible for the proceedings of those who meddle with the sexual question, before they have laid the foundation of true faith and union with God. 20. Dividing the sexual relation into two branches, the amative. Religious communitarians 59 and propagative, the amative or love relation is first in importance, as it is in the order of nature. God made woman because he saw it was not good for man to be alone. General 2:18, i.e., for social, not primarily for propagative, purposes. Eve was called Adam's helpmeet. In the whole of the specific account of the creation of woman, she is regarded as his companion, and her maternal office is not brought into view. General 2:18-25. Amativeness was necessarily the first social affection developed in the Garden of Eden. The second commandment of the eternal law of love, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, had amativeness for its first channel, for Eve was at first Adam's only neighbor. Propagation and the affections connected with it did not commence their operation during the period of innocence. After the fall, God said to the woman, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception, from which it is to be inferred that in the original state, conception would have been comparatively infrequent. 21. The amative part of the sexual relation, separate from the propagative, is eminently favorable to life. It is not a source of life, as some would make it, but it is the first and best distributive of life. Adam and Eve, in their original state, derived their life from God. General 2:7. As God is a dual being, the Father and the Son, and man was made in his image, a dual life passed from God to man. Adam was the channel specially of the life of the Father, and Eve of the life of the Son. Amativeness was the natural agency of the distribution and mutual action of these two forms of life. In this primitive position of the sexes, which is their normal position in Christ, each reflects upon the other the love of God. Each excites and develops the divine action in the other. 22. The propagative part of the sexual relation is in its nature the expensive department. 1. While amativeness keeps the capital stock of life circulating between two, propagation introduces a third partner. 2. The propagative act is a drain on the life of man, and when habitual, produces disease. 3. The infirmities and vital expenses of woman during the long period of pregnancy waste her constitution. 4. The awful agonies of childbirth heavily tax the life of woman. 5. The cares of the nursing period bear heavily on woman. 6. The cares of both parents, through the period of the childhood of their offspring, are many and burdensome. 7. The labor of man is greatly increased by the necessity of providing for children. A portion of these expenses would undoubtedly have been curtailed. 60. Socialism in America if human nature had remained in its original integrity, and will be, when it is restored. But it is still self-evident that the birth of children, viewed either as a vital or mechanical operation, is in its nature expensive, and the fact that multiplied conception was imposed as a curse, indicates that it was so regarded by the Creator. Quarter IV. Showing how the sexual function is to be redeemed, and true relations between the sexes restored. Proposition 23. The amative and propagative functions are distinct from each other, and may be separated practically. They are confounded in the world, both in the theories of physiologists and in universal practice. The amative function is regarded merely as a bait to the propagative, and is merged in it. But if amativeness is, as we have seen, the first and noblest of the social affections, and if the propagative part of the sexual relation was originally secondary, and became paramount by the subversion of order in the fall, we are bound to raise the amative office of the sexual organs into a distinct and paramount function. Here follows a full exposition of the doctrine of self-control or male continence, which is an essential part of the Oneida theory, but may properly be omitted in this history. Quarter V. Showing that shame, instead of being one of the prime virtues, is a part of original sin and belongs to the apostasy. Proposed TION 24. Sexual shame was the consequence of the fall, and is factitious and irrational. General 225. Compare 3-7. Adam and Eve, while innocent, had no shame. Little children have none. Other animals have none. Quapre V. Showing the bearings of the preceding views on socialism, political economy, manners and customs, etc. Proposition 25. The foregoing principles concerning the sexual relation open the way for association. 1. They furnish motives. They apply to larger partnerships the same attractions that draw and bind together pairs in the worldly partnership of marriage. A community home in which each is married to all, and where love is honored and cultivated, will be as much more attractive than an ordinary home, as the community outnumbers a pair. 2. These principles remove the principal obstructions in the way of association. There is plenty of tendency to crossing love and adultery, even in the system. Religious communitarians 61 of isolated households. Association increases this tendency. Amalgamation of interests, frequency of interview, and companionship in labor, inevitably give activity and intensity to the social attractions in which amativeness is the strongest element. The tendency to extramatrimonial love will be proportioned to the condensation of interests produced by any given form of association. That is, if the ordinary principles of exclusiveness are preserved, association will be a worse school of temptation to unlawful love than the world is, in proportion to its social advantages. Love, in the exclusive form, has jealousy for its complement, and jealousy brings on strife and division. Association, therefore, if it retains one love exclusiveness, contains the seeds of dissolution, and those seeds will be hastened to their harvest by the warmth of associate life. An association of states with custom house lines around each is sure to be quarrelsome. The further states in that situation are apart, and the more their interests are isolated, the better. The only way to prevent smuggling and strife in a confederation of contiguous states is to abolish custom house lines from the interior, and declare free trade and free transit, collecting revenues and fostering home products by one custom house line around the whole. This is the policy of the heavenly system, that they all, not 2 and 2, maybe 1, 26. In Yiddle society, strength will be increased and the necessity of labor diminished, till work will become sport, as it would have been in the original Eden state. General 215, compare 3:17-19. Labor is sport or drudgery according to the proportion between strength and the work to be done. Work that overtasks a child is easy to a man. The amount of work remaining the same, if man's strength were doubled, the result would be the same as if the amount of work were diminished 1/2. To make labor sport, therefore, we must first, increase of strength, and secondly, diminution of work. Or, as in the former problem relating to the curse on woman, first, enlargement of income, and secondly, diminution of expenses. Vital society secures both of these objects. It increases strength by placing the individual in a vital organization, which is in communication with the source of life, and which distributes and circulates life with the highest activity. And at the same time, by its compound economies, it reduces the work to be done to a minimum. 27. In vital society labor will become attractive. Loving companionship in labor, and especially the mingling of the sexes, makes labor attractive. The present division of labor between the sexes. 62. Socialism in America separates them entirely. The woman keeps house and the man labors abroad. Instead of this, in vital society men and women will mingle in both of their peculiar departments of work. It will be economically as well as spiritually profitable to marry them indoors and out, by day as well as by night. When the partition between the sexes is taken away, and man ceases to make woman a propagative drudge, when love takes the place of shame, and fashion follows nature in dress and business, men and women will be able to mingle in all their employments, as boys and girls mingle in their sports, and then labor will be attractive. 28. We can now see our way to victory over death. Reconciliation with God opens the way for the reconciliation of the sexes. Reconciliation of the sexes emancipates woman, and opens the way for vital society. Vital society increases strength, diminishes work, and makes labor attractive, thus removing the antecedents of death. First we abolish sin, then shame, then the curse on woman of exhausting childbearing, then the curse on man of exhausting labor, and so we arrive regularly at the tree of life. I.e. Chapter 3, the secular communitarians. Any character, from the best to the worst, from the most ignorant to the most enlightened, may be given to any community, even to the world at large. Rosbert T. Owen, Essay First, A New View of Society, 1813. And here we now are, as near perhaps as we can be in the center of the United States, even, as it were, like the little grain of mustard seed. But with these great truths before us, with the practices of the social system, as soon as it shall be well understood among us, our principles will, I trust, spread from community to community, from state to state, from continent to continent, until this system and these truths shall overshadow the whole earth, shedding fragrance and abundance, intelligence and happiness, upon all the sons of man. Rosert Owen, Speech at New Harmony, July 4, 1826. Far away in the distant future I saw a globe resplendent, cultivated and embellished, transformed into the grandest and most beautiful work of art by the combined effort of humanity. I saw upon it a race developed, perfected by the continued influence, generation after generation, of true social institutions, a humanity worthy of that cosmic soul of which I instinctively felt it to be a part. Albert Brisbane, Redelia Brisbane, Albert Brisbane, A Mental Biography, 1893. Alonz N. Icary, Etienne Cabot, 1847. 64. Socialism in America. In 1819 the United States experienced the first economic slump in its history. Industrial production and the price of goods dropped sharply, unemployment rose in the large cities, banks failed by the score, and farmers and businessmen found themselves more deeply in debt than ever. The Depression, which had descended very suddenly, provoked a lively debate between long-standing antagonists. On the one hand, the Hamiltonian-oriented conservatives argued that to preserve order and prosperity the government must collaborate more closely with the large commercial and banking interests. It must impose higher tariffs, augment the authority of the Bank of the United States, and stimulate native industries. On the other hand, the agrarian radicals attributed America's difficulties to the moneyed aristocracy and to monopolies in general, and favored government policies beneficial to small farmers, small businessmen, and mechanics. Whatever their differences, both the conservatives and the radicals took the rights of property for granted, rights that, they assumed, derived from natural law and preceded society itself. Their essential disagreement turned on the question of how and for whom the property should be distributed. There was also a third position, which had not been heard before because it lay outside the traditional limits of controversy in America. In 1820, a New York City physician named Cornelius C. Blatchley published an essay on Commonwealth, a brief tract that offered a novel analysis of the prevailing injustice in the country, along with a novel plan to abolish it. The injustice, Blatchley maintained, resulted not from the way property was parceled out, but from the existence of private property as such. To justify property as a natural right was a fallacy. It was a gift conferred by society upon privileged individuals. It could, therefore, be withdrawn at any time to serve the collectivity. This withdrawal, the assertion of society's preeminence over the individual, would, in fact, restore to man the equality he once had when he roamed the forests and fields in his unassociated state of nature. If men lived in pure and perfect communities, where all things were as they should be. Blatchley wrote, man's social rights would not destroy, as they now do, the natural rights he possessed in his wild and unassociated state. And, as men claimed a right in their natural and unassociated state to everything around them, so they should claim, in a pure community, a right to all around them. The secular communitarian's 65 unities, where the good of the collectivity would replace the selfishness and individualism on which property rights rested. To advance that proposal he founded, in 1820, the New York Society for Propagating Communities, for which the essay on Common Wealth was to serve as preface and justification. Blatchley hoped that, the pious of all denominations, every religious congregation, would somehow institute a system of social, equal, and inclusive rights, interests, liberties, and privileges to all real and personal property. Yet he was no religious communitarian. Conversion of the pious was to be only the first step toward a universal, trans-denominational reform of man. He conceived the pure community as the instrument of moral virtue, not salvation, of material happiness, not spiritual beatitude. How to live the rational life was Blatchley's credo, as it was the credo of every secular communitarian of the 19th century. There were a surprisingly large number of people in America who thought as Blatchley did, surprising because standard histories of the period have ignored them. Some of them were attracted to his society for promoting communities. A few zealots actually sought to create little commonwealths, but nothing came of their efforts. By and large, the advocates of secular communities in America were, like Blatchley, intellectuals who lived in cities, mainly New York and Philadelphia. They included a high proportion of European émigrés who had fled the despotism and unreason of the Old World. There were, for example, William McClure, a pioneer geologist, Charles A. Lesueur, a naturalist, Thomas Say, a zoologist, and three active disciples of Pestalozzi, Marie Frattigio, Fitbol d'Arasmont, and Joseph Neef. Pestalozzi was the famous Swiss educator whose experimental schools eschewed class distinctions and taught children to learn by doing and to value manual work as highly as abstract knowledge. Educational reform along Pestalozzian lines was the integument that united this heterodox group of foreign-born communitarians. They envisioned pure communities as places where the pursuit of science and learning would replace the pursuit of self-interest, where harmony would replace coercion, where each would obey himself in the act of obeying all. In his essay, Blatchley omitted to say in his own words just what kind of pure communities he had in mind or how they were to be organized. Instead, he included long excerpts from Robert 66. Socialism in America Tension. It was in Owen's writings that Blatchley found a program of the future most akin to his own. In effect, he and the other communitarians were Owenites, the first such group to emerge outside of Owen's own little circle in Britain. Though they did not know it at the time, Owen himself would presently come to America to build a pure community. The force of Owen's ideas could be ascribed in part to his great fame as a man of action and as a reformer. His life was already a legend. In 1781, at the age of 10, he left his home in Wales and began to make his way in the world. It did not take him long to prove that he was a managerial genius. At 20, he was running a huge cotton mill in Manchester. 9 years later, he became the director and part owner of the new Lanark, Scotland, cotton mills, one of the largest factory complexes in the world. As he rose in wealth and position, his passion for reform deepened. Early in his youth, he had concluded that religion was the bane of mankind and had come to embrace, as he later described it, the spirit of universal charity, not for a sect or a party, or for a country or a color, but for the human race, and with a real and ardent desire to do them good. The particular object of Owen's charity was the working-class poor, whose condition had been deteriorating under industrialism. He was one of the first to be struck by the paradox of progress. As wealth grew, thanks to the introduction of labor-saving machinery, the lot of labor worsened. At New Lanark, he was in a position to help the working class, or that segment of it that he employed. Turning his managerial genius to humanitarian ends, he transformed a demoralized, run-down, debauched company town into a model community, admired by philanthropic-minded visitors from all over the world. Owen saw to it that the workers enjoyed full employment, health, housing, and sanitary conditions were exemplary, and the children received at least a rudimentary education. But he was not interested in mere good deeds. He regarded New Lanark as a laboratory for testing his social theories. Adopting the views of the most audacious of the French philosophies, e.g. Condillac, La Métairie, Helvetius, Condorcet, and the English agrarians, best typified by William Godwin, Owen assumed that man's character was shaped by his physical and social environment. If the environment could be mastered, so could one's character, and so therefore could the conditions of one's happiness. How was the secular communitarian's 67 environment, and one's self, to be mastered? By science and rationality, in other words, by overcoming religious superstition, caprice, sectarianism, and selfishness. But the discipline of science and rationality had to be inculcated in one's youth. The older generation was after all the product of its environment. And so for Owen the logic of reform was incontrovertible. Education alone unlocked the door to happiness and self-mastery. The task was to create an environment congenial to such a system of education. Owen arrived at the communitarian position slowly under the stress of events. The Great Depression and civic disorders that swept Britain, amounting almost to a civil war, after 1816 persuaded him that the conventional methods of dealing with poverty and unemployment, namely, the poor laws, were inadequate, viciously punitive, and ultimately self-defeating. He concluded that only the total reformation of society was equal to the enormity of the problem. Accordingly, in 1817 he brought out his plan for the establishment of villages of cooperation, to be financed by the state and by rich philanthropists. He spent thousands of pounds subsidizing publication of his plan in leading newspapers, and before long the entire country was aware of his new view of society. Owen was typical of the social theorists of the day in his propensity for drawing up very detailed blueprints and charts. His plan left nothing to chance or spontaneity. Each cooperative village was to contain between 500 and 1,500 people. It was to be a mixture, or rather an organic unity, of agriculture and industry, country and city life, private and communal functions. The buildings were to be arranged in the form of a parallelogram. Each family was to possess its own apartment, though the children over 3 were to be brought up by the community. The school, the library, the children's quarters, the kitchen and dining hall, the reading room, and the place of worship were to occupy a cluster of buildings in the center of the parallelogram. Work was to be done in another part of the village. The establishment of the first such village, Owen was certain, would announce the era of emancipated humanity. The transition from the old order to the new would be rapid and peaceful. The only real practical difficulty, the logical contradiction here is obvious and goes to the heart of the whole Enlightenment conception of life. If the environment determines character, how is it possible to begin the process of reform? How could the chain of environmental cause and characterological effect ever be broken? 68. Socialism in America, he wrote, will be to restrain men from rushing too precipitately from one to the other. Who would not prefer to live a life of virtue, harmony, freedom, and abundance? At the same time, Owen hastened to emphasize that the purpose of village cooperatives was to produce happy and healthy Englishmen, not outlaws and rebels. He had no intention, that is, of encouraging class conflict. In fact, his plan carefully observed the proprieties of class and status. It called for the creation of 4 types of villages, each inhabited by a different social stratum: paupers, workers, moderately rich, and extremely rich. And to ensure that the distinctions of the outside world were maintained, for a while at least, the prospective villagers were to be classified according to their particular religious and political affiliations. Owen came up with no less than 140 possible combinations, so that, to take an extreme example, a man who was a high church Anglican and a Tory could not be thrown together with a dissenter and a liberal Whig. Owen made these concessions to the spirit of privilege, sect, and faction because he felt he had no choice. How else would he receive financial support? But he failed to win over men of substance, and the government dismissed his scheme. Owen was regarded as a worthy and talented man who had gone eccentric. Apart from a few reformers, Jeremy Bentham and several other philosophical radicals, no one shared his optimism about human nature and the possibilities of education. Many were alienated by his profound and openly expressed opposition to religion. On this matter he offered no concessions. Yet if there was one conviction held by the upper classes of Britain and the rest of Europe, Owen solicited support on the continent too. It was that religion, as defined by established churches, was the bulwark of social order. They were not about to subscribe to a plan, however humanitarian and well-intentioned, that might undermine their authority. The French Revolution was still fresh in their minds. When it became clear to him that he was getting nowhere, Owen decided to leave the old immoral world and set up a cooperative colony in the United States, where the people were free, open-minded, and idealistic, where he could begin afresh, with a pure environment, as it were. He had previously shown no apparent interest in the country or its people. His proselyting efforts had been concentrated exclusively in the old immoral world. Thus his decision was not the result of careful research and reflection, but the secular communitarian's 69, a sudden response to a fortuitous event. In the summer of 1824 he learned that Father George Rapp was offering to sell Harmony, Indiana, with its 20,000 acres of cultivated land, its well-laid streets, its factories, mills, shops, and houses. Here was an opportunity that Owen could not let go by. He saw Harmony as the first of countless village cooperatives in America. In August he provisionally agreed to buy the property for $135,000, and 2 months later he sailed for the United States. He arrived in New York City in November and proceeded slowly and circuitously to Indiana. Wherever he stopped en route he received a triumphant welcome, not only from his followers, who looked forward to joining him later on, but from a host of prominent Americans. After signing the contract with Father Rapp, he went on a second tour, which was an even greater triumph. He was now a public celebrity, a subject of constant interest in the press. The crowning moment came in Washington, on February 25, 1825. In the Hall of Representatives, before the chief dignitaries of the country, outgoing President James Monroe, President-elect John Quincy Adams, House Speaker Henry Clay, and numerous representatives, senators, Supreme Court justices, and cabinet members, Owen spoke at length of his plans for the future and for America. His audience seemed to find nothing odd or reprehensible in his ideas. His principle of communal living did not offend them. They might even have approved of it, for they returned 10 days later to hear him a second time. Owen was not surprised by his reception in America. The people, he assumed, were applauding not him but the ideas he embodied and would soon put into operation. He expected the new system to carry everything before it. The United States, he wrote with customary euphoria, but particularly the states west of the Allegheny Mountains have been prepared in the most remarkable manner for the new system. The principle of union and cooperation for the promotion of all the virtues and for the creation of wealth is now universally admitted to be superior to the individual selfish system, and all seem prepared or are rapidly preparing to give up the latter and adopt the former. In fact, the whole of this country is ready to commence a new empire upon the principle of public property and to discard private property and the uncharitable notion that 70. Socialism in America. Man can form his own character on the foundation and root of all evil. For years past everything seems to have been preparing in an unaccountable and most remarkable manner for my arrival overnight. No study has been made by scholars of the GU or so people who crowded into the village of New Harmony, as it was now called, in the spring of 1825. But from available accounts we know that an unusually high number of them were city dwellers who had come for idealistic reasons, and that comparatively few, that is compared to the ratio for the country as a whole, were skilled workers and farmers. In other words, Owen admitted individuals and families indiscriminately, without careful screening, and therefore without regard for the requirements of the community. And after taking up residence in New Harmony they waited for an unconscionably long time before being assigned to a work routine. The haphazardness of the experiment in its critical first stage was all the more startling in view of Owen's obsessive theorizing and planning. The contrast between the exigencies of life and the symmetry of the drawing board could not have been more sharply drawn. Owen, however, was unperturbed. He expected difficulties during the period of transition from an individualistic to a communitarian society. That was why he called New Harmony a halfway house, the best, he claimed, I could procure for those who are going to travel this extraordinary journey with me, and although it is not intended to be our permanent residence, I hope it will be found not a bad traveler's tavern, in which we shall remain only until we can change our old garments, and fully prepare ourselves for the new state of existence into which we hope to enter. It was while Owen was away, inexplicably, he went to Britain for a long visit just when New Harmony needed him most, that the society began to function with some coherence. It organized frequent public lectures, discussions, sports, and other forms of amusement, permitted religious meetings of each denomination to take place, sent the children, 130 of them, to well-staffed boarding schools, published a fine newspaper, the New Harmony Gazette, and established a primitive division of labor. But it was the secular communitarians 71 very far from being economically self-sufficient. Most of the inhabitants subsisted on funds, about $1.50 a week each, supplied by Owen, and no equitable standard existed for measuring one's productive capacity against one's withdrawal from the common fund. Nonetheless, Owen was as sanguine as ever when he retuned in January 1826. He was impressed by New Harmony's solidarity and high spirits and was confident that the economy would soon right itself. He was especially pleased by the arrival of 40 distinguished scientists and educators, freethinkers, reformers, and communitarians, all led by the wealthy geologist, William McClure. Some of them sought to continue the work that Pestalozzi had begun in Switzerland. Others set about creating an academy of science and manual training. New Harmony was developing into the educational laboratory that Owen had always envisaged. He was so convinced that New Harmony was successfully launched, he suddenly brought the transition period to a close. It had lasted 9 months instead of the minimum of 2 years he had originally prescribed. The people of New Harmony, he decided, no longer needed a halfway house. In its place arose a permanent structure, a community of equality, in which all property was held in common and authority resided in a democratically elected council representing the various community departments: general economy, domestic economy, agriculture, manufacture, education, science, etc. But it was just when Owen was driving New Harmony toward communism that its fragile structure came apart. Inevitably, the differences of class and status and culture that had been formed by the outside environment asserted themselves. The wonder was that they had not exploded sooner than they did. "Oh, if you could see some of the rough, uncouth creatures here," complained a lady who had come to New Harmony because she was an idealist, "I think you would find it rather hard to look upon them as brothers and sisters." Conflicts appeared between the intellectuals and the manual workers, between the freethinkers and the pious, between the English settlers, a very small minority, and the Americans, between the extreme egalitarians and those who favored a scale of wages corresponding to productivity, and, not least, between Owen and his chief collaborator, William McClure, who finally built his own school and ran his own sub-community on the premises. With New Harmony riven by hostile factions and his fortune nearly exhausted, Owen gave up the experiment 2 years after. 72. Socialism in America starting it and allowed the settlers to buy or lease the property on generous terms. New Harmony thus became another American hamlet, but its inhabitants did not soon forget what it had once been and stood for. After abandoning New Harmony, Owen, undaunted as ever, sought to interest the Mexican government in his village cooperative scheme. When this fell through, he shook the dust of the New World from his feet and returned to Britain, to fresh struggles for social reform, fresh triumphs and defeats. In its brief career, New Harmony provided a model of community building for Owenite groups in other parts of the country. Some well-to-do Cincinnatians organized a colony in Yellow Springs, Ohio, the present site of Antioch College, in the summer of 1825. Early the next year, a Philadelphia contingent settled in Valley Forge. Meanwhile, a group of New York City free thinkers and utopians, Cornelius Blatchley was not among them, created an Owenite society in Haverstraw, about 30 miles up the Hudson. Later, most of them emigrated further upstate to participate in another communitarian experiment in Coxsackie. 2 other Owenite communities arose in 1826, in Blue Springs, Indiana, near Bloomington, and in Kendall, Ohio, now Massillon. Although all of these colonies had certain obvious advantages over New Harmony, they were quite small and homogeneous, and the settlers knew each other. Few lasted more than 6 months. 1. Kendall held out for as long as 3 years. Their virtue and high-mindedness were the root of their problem. Even more than New Harmony, they attracted middle-class idealists, not skilled workers, who could, during good times at least, count on high wages and abundant opportunities. Workers lacked certain options. They could not afford to escape from the toils of the open market. One Owenite colony deserves special mention, the famous Neshoba community in Shelby County, Tennessee. Its founder, Frances Wright, was one of the remarkable women of that era, the forerunner of a whole generation of female reformers in America, none of whom, however, proved to be as much a femme terrible as she. Born in 1795 of a prosperous Scots family, she was espousing radical ideas in her youth and writing treatises on morals which brought her to the attention of, among other philosophers, Bentham and the elder Mill. One of her books was an encomiastic description of America, which she wrote following a long stay in the secular communitarian's 73 country. Lafayette liked the book, made her acquaintance, and became a close friend, so close that he took her with him when he sailed to the United States in 1824. Inevitably, she found her way to New Harmony, where she converted to secular communitarianism. For some time she had been thinking about solutions to the slavery problem. Now, thanks to her newfound faith, she came up with one. Briefly, her plan was to settle from 50 to 100 slaves in village cooperatives, where they could, within 10 years, earn the price of their freedom by their own labor, and simultaneously acquire the habits of self-reliance. Each colony would be a school of industry. To the Southern slave owner she held out the promise of gradual, peaceful, and even profitable manumission. She actually received some help from them, enough, at any rate, to buy 15 slaves and 2,000 acres of land on the Wolf River, near Memphis. When a group of idealistic whites, including her sister, arrived in 1826, Frances White began the Neshoba experiment. On its outcome, she felt, rested the hopes of American republicanism. Her communitarian ideas grew more and more daring. She concluded that family life should be abolished as well as private property, sexual equality guaranteed no less than economic and racial equality. She interpreted the emancipation of mankind to mean desire unleashed and fulfilled. Let us not teach, she wrote in her explanatory notes on Neshoba, that virtue consists in crucifying of the affections and appetites but in their judicious government. Let us not attach ideas of purity to monastic chastity, impossible to man or woman without consequences fraught with evil, nor ideas of vice to connections formed under auspices of kind feeling. To these scandalous words, the explanatory notes were printed in a Memphis newspaper, was added scandalous behavior. The world learned that the blacks and whites of Neshoba were freely cohabiting. The people of Colby County were outraged by the presence of one great brothel in their midst, though sexual intercourse between blacks and whites was not unknown in the slave South. Neshoba's troubles, however, were not with the public nor with its neighbors, they were economic and self-generated. Its debt had not diminished in the course of a year. Not enough was being produced to pay for upkeep, much less to amortize the capital, i.e., the cost of the slaves. In hopes of salvaging at least some of 74. Socialism in America, the experiment, Wright and a group of trustees, among them Owen and Lafayette, whom she had appointed to oversee Neshoba, tried unsuccessfully to replace cooperative labor with a system of private property. The colony lingered on until 1830, when the slaves were packed off to Haiti and the land was sold to the highest bidder. One can dismiss Neshoba as an interesting but grotesquely utopian scheme. Yet it was no more utopian than any of the realistic plans for dealing with slavery, such as colonizing the slaves in Liberia, dreamed up by the most responsible and level-headed statesmen of the time. While the Owenite communities disappeared, the Owenites did not. The upsurge of radical reform, which began in the mid-1820s, gave them a new lease on life. The thrust of reform came from two main directions. From debtor farmers and small entrepreneurs strapped by high interest rates imposed by large banks, in particular, the Bank of the United States, and from working men, actually, skilled craftsmen and nascent manufacturers, threatened by monopolies. Workingmen's parties sprang up first in Philadelphia, then in New York and Boston, and by 1830 in most of the urban centers of the country. Throughout this vast republic, wrote in Albany newspaper, the farmers, mechanics and workingmen are assembling to impart to its laws and administration those principles of liberty and equality unfolded in the Declaration of Independence. Specifically, the workingmen wanted a 10-hour day, elimination of imprisonment for debt, free public education for their children, and the extension of the voting franchise. Owen's ideas struck root in this rich soil. In 1826 one Langdon Bilesby, a Philadelphia printer and inventor, wrote a short treatise, Observations on the Sources and Effects of Unequal Wealth, which argued for a socialist commonwealth. Like Owen, Bilesby looked forward to a society where men would work few hours and possess an abundance of all things that the most voluptuous now enjoy. But unlike Owen, he thought this state of happiness could be best accomplished if all the producers of wealth united their forces on a national scale, using the existing political system. Bilesby, little known though he was, pointed the way toward a broader, more inclusive conception of socialism based on the economic and class realities of American life. In 1829, the most vigorous of the workingmen's parties arose in New York City, where the Owenite influence was deepest. 1. The secular communitarian 75 faction of the New York Workingmen's Party was led by Thomas Skidmore, a mechanic and journalist, who preached an extreme form of egalitarianism. His long and tedious book, The Rights of Man to Property, kept faith with the agrarian tradition of William Godwin and the later Tom Paine, vide Agrarian Justice, in calling upon the state to expropriate superfluous wealth and redivide it into equal lots. This peaceful revolutionary upheaval, according to Skidmore, should take place once every generation on the theory that the earth belonged to the living. Once the wealth was distributed, the tasks of social and individual regeneration would immediately follow. Opposing Skidmore in the same party was a group headed by Owen's son, Robert Dale Owen, and Francis Wright. They had recently moved to New York from New Harmony, bringing with them the New Harmony Gazette, renamed the Free Inquirer. Fanny Wright now came into her own as a speaker and purveyor of heterodox ideas. Workers eagerly attended her lengthy exhortations against capitalists and prelates and coercive authority in general. And the more insulting the criticisms leveled at her, whore of Babylon, and priestess of Beelzebub, were among the better-known epithets, the greater her popularity became. She and Robert Dale Owen felt that Skidmore was damaging the cause of the working man. While they, too, believed in absolute economic equality, as ex-communitarians they had come to realize that man must be re-educated before society could be revolutionized. They proposed the establishment of state-run boarding schools, cut off from the polluted environment of adult society, where children would learn to live cooperatively, rely exclusively on reason, and prize science and the mechanical arts. In other words, they wanted to graft the New Harmony experience on the stem of a modest reform program that would prove acceptable to the electorate. These disputes between contending factions of the New York Workingmen's Party quickly burned themselves out. Skidmore died in 1832, the same year Fanny Wright left America, only to return in 1837 and settle down to a rather sedentary married life in Cincinnati, and Robert Dale Owen went off to Indiana, where he later attained some prominence as a Democratic politician. Eventually the Workingmen's Party in New York, as elsewhere, joined the Radical Democrats in a common struggle against the Bank of the United States, the creditor class, and the privileged corporations. 76. Socialism in America. And so, at last, the Owenite movement ran its course, leaving only the religious sects to uphold the claims of beneficent society over predatory individualism. It was the Panic of 1837 and the consequent Depression that revived the dormant ideal of secular communitarianism. Although small farmers and unskilled workers suffered most from the breakdown of the economy, the new communitarianism drew its adherents primarily from the educated middle class. Fearful of losing their status, offended by the congenital disorders, the wastefulness, and the inequities to which unrestrained capitalism was prone, actuated by humanitarianism, and vivified by the hope of personal redemption, these concerned members of the middle class embraced the social philosophy of Charles Fourier. Discussions of Fourierism, or Associationism, the name of its American variant, filled the pages of numerous publications in the 1840s. It called forth a passionate response from intellectuals, Unitarian ministers, and idealists of every persuasion. For a season it excited the country as few of the other multitudinous reform movements of the period did. Hardly anyone in America had heard of Fourier before 1840, the year Albert Brisbane published his Social Destiny of Man. This book, which contained some translations of Fourier's writings along with Brisbane's exegesis, marked the beginning of associationism in America. Brisbane himself might be defined as the prototypical associationist. Born in 1809 in Batavia, New York, in a district notably receptive to one or another variety of millenarianism, he received a broadly liberal, secular, and humanistic education. His tolerant, well-to-do father encouraged him to pursue the truth wherever it led him and at whatever expense. In the late 1820s, while observing the unspeakable contrast between wealth and poverty in Paris, Brisbane was struck by the fact that a certain class in society lived on the labor of the masses. To resolve all the questions that this raised in his mind, he went to Berlin to study under Hegel. But he was dissatisfied with the great philosopher's answer, as he was with all the others he subsequently encountered in his travels through Eutrope. One day he happened to look into Charles Fourier's L'Association Domestique Agricole. The scales fell from his eyes and the truth was revealed to him. Now for the first time, Brisbane later recalled, I had come across an idea which I had never met before, the idea of dignifying and rendering attractive the manual labor of mankind. Labor hitherto regarded as divine punishment inflicted. The secular communitarians 77 on man. He hastened to Paris to meet Fourier and study the master's teachings firsthand. In 1834 he returned to America as the apostle of a new secular millennial faith. To Fourier, as to his followers, the quest for justice was at bottom the quest for order and harmony. Fourier's genius lay in his capacity, demonic in its thoroughness, to systematize the world. All things found their exact place in his monumental hierarchy of classification. And they fell into place because they were subject to the cosmic principle of attraction. Fourier, who did not pretend to modesty, conceived of himself as the only authentic legatee of Newton and Copernicus. He believed that he had consummated their labors. Man, according to Fourier, obeyed the principle of attraction through his 12 passions. These rose hierarchically on the scale of social values, from the 5 senses to the more universalizing passions, such as friendship, love, ambition, and paternity. The combinations of these formed an endless number of possibilities, which determined the character of each person. Unlike Owen, whose theories he derided, Fourier asserted that the passions were unalterable. The duty of man was to create a society that would liberate them and so permit human nature to follow its normal course. His perfect society, the phalanx or association, attempted to reconcile apparent opposites. The most rigorous planning and the greatest degree of freedom. His blueprint was similar to Owen's in omitting no detail, in accounting for every contingency. He specified how many people the phalanx should contain, between 1800 and 2000, how much space it should occupy, how the buildings should be arranged and whom they should house, what vocations should be taken up, agriculture being the primary one, and, most important, of course, how the young should be educated. Fourier saw these rules not as restraints but as the indispensable conditions of a free and passionate life. Only by submitting to them could the inhabitants of the phalanx act as they pleased, choose their livelihoods, or choose none, read, play, make love, in short, do whatever they desired. Coercion would disappear, so would the parasitism of state and church, so would acquisitiveness and want. Human nature, then, would shape the organization of the phalanx. The free play of the passions would lead people to engage spontaneously in the common activities that best suited them. Those who were attracted to animals might form a group of cattle raisers or a group of veterinarians, each containing from 7 to 78. Socialism in America, 35 members. Cognate groups would form a series, e.g., cattle raising would be incorporated in the farming series, the totality of copyright which would constitute the phalanx as a whole. Within loosely defined limits, the members would be encouraged to experiment freely and improvise. The more energetic or passionate they were, the greater the number and variety of groups and series they would establish. Fourier hoped the phalanx would be as diverse, as heterogeneous, as richly textured as possible. But while he abhorred competition as alien to freely felt and expressed passions, he opposed common ownership of property. Under his rules of equity, which read like a carefully drafted business contract, each person would be rewarded according to his mode of activity. Those who labored with their hands would receive 1/12 more than those who invested capital, and those who invested capital would receive 1/12 more than those who contributed their talent and intellect. Fourier had no doubt that phalanxes, once erected, would prove irresistible. He envisioned the time when they would cover the earth, some 2 million of them, each self-sufficient, each living in perfect concord with the rest. It was this incandescent hope that Brisbane brought home with him in 1834. But not until 1840, when he published his work on Fourierism, did he find converts. Chief among them was Horace Greeley, the well-known writer, publisher, and defender of radical causes. Greeley went over to the associationist faith because, like Brisbane, he had become convinced that piecemeal help for the poor resolved nothing and that only the total transformation of society could end poverty and rapacity and restore to labor the full measure of its productivity. The New York Tribune, which he founded in 1842, spread the associationist gospel far and wide. Soon a host of intellectuals recruited from the Brahmin caste, Park Godwin, John Dwight, William Henry Channing, Charles A. Dana, George Ripley, and others, had joined the movement. They were as active as early Christians and inspired by the same certainty of triumph. To work out a common creed, they held a succession of councils, they planned the building of phalanxes, and brought out a plethora of magazines and pamphlets. They had been swept up by a new revivalism as absolute as any of the grosser messianic movements of the day in promising absolution from evil. The titles of some of their publications will suggest the intensity of their optimism: The Future, The Pathfinder, The Harbinger, The Spirit of the Age, The New Industrial World, etc. Associationism appealed to liberal-minded Americans who thirsted for religion even as they rejected established theologies and churches. Associationism forged the link between the eternal and the temporal. Under its dispensation, pain and negation would be banished from human affairs. Man would be in harmony with himself, with other men, and with the universe at large. Our moral aim is the grandest that ever elevated human thought, said Park Godwin, the most eloquent of the associationist preachers. We want the love and wisdom of the highest to make their daily abode with us. We wish to see all mankind happy and good. We desire to emancipate the human body and the human soul. We long for unity between man and man in true society, between man and nature by the cultivation of the earth, and between man and God, in universal joy and religion. But in exalting the highest, the associationists kept their distance from the tempests and ephemeralities of everyday life as experienced by common men. To be sure, Brisbane, Godwin, Greeley and the others sympathized with contemporary reform movements. They supported the abolitionists, the trade unions that plumped for a 10-hour day, the advocates of temperance and women's rights. But these worthy ends, they believed, would come about only through the establishment of a network of phalanxes. They opposed the conventional radical strategy of turning the lower classes against the upper, of inciting conflict, of using power to destroy power. They believed that power must be transcended. In 1842, a handful of associationists from Brooklyn bought land in the Pennsylvania Poconos, but their phalanx never came to life. A year later, near the same site, a larger and wealthier New York City group, aided by Greeley, formed the Sylvania Association. Soon phalanxes were sprouting like mushrooms across northern United States, from the East Coast to the Mississippi River. For a while the leading associationists were convinced that their moment had arrived, that the social destiny of man was about to be fulfilled. But their celebrations were, to say the least, short-lived. Most of the phalanxes expired in the year of their birth. Of the 28 known to have been created, there were others of which no records were kept. Only 2 lasted as long as 5 years. 1. The North American Phalanx, near Red Bank, New Jersey, held out for 12 years. IZED work, too little capital, and too much reliance on hope, good intentions, and the prophecies of Fourier. The most famous of the associationist experiments, Brook Farm, was a case in point. It was founded in 1841 as a religious utopia, the West Roxbury community, not a Fourierist one. Its mission was to provide a spiritual sanctuary for the radical Unitarians and Transcendentalists of the Boston area. led by such men as George Ripley and William Henry Channing, the nephew of the founder of Unitarianism. The West Roxbury community grew increasingly secular and universal in its moral philosophy. In 1843 it was renamed the Brook Farm Institute of Agriculture and Education. The purpose of the institute, said George Ripley, its guiding spirit, was to ensure a more natural union between intellectual and manual labor than now exists, to combine the thinker and the worker, as far as possible in the same individual, to guarantee the highest mental freedom, by providing all with labor adapted to their tastes and talents, and securing to them the fruits of their industry, to do away with the necessity of menial services by opening the benefits of education and the profits of labor to all, and thus to prepare a society of liberal, intelligent, and cultivated persons, whose relation with each other would permit a more wholesome and simple life than can be led amidst the pressure of our competitive institutions. By 1845 the Brook Farm Institute had become the Brook Farm Phalanx, and it was professing Fourierism as its official ideology. The example of Brook Farm, Channing claimed, would indoctrinate America with the principle of associative unity. The nation, like one man, would organize into townships upon the basis of perfect justice. For a time Brook Farm did quite well. Membership rose from 30 to 70 and preparations went on apace to accommodate many more. Occupational groups and series were formed according to Fourier's teachings. The workday was short, 10 hours in the summer, 8 in the winter, and the duties were varied and interesting, especially for those unaccustomed to manual work. During their leisure time the members edified and amused themselves with discussions, readings, lectures, concerts, dances, and visits by distinguished guests. Some of them worked on the Harbinger. The Secular Communitarians 81. Brook Farm's official publication, which was by all accounts the best of the Fourierist journals and, indeed, one of the best journals of its kind ever put out in America. The school, the pride of the Phalanx, introduced radical changes both in the curriculum and in the method of pedagogy. Students were taught to overcome the invidious distinctions that characterized the outside world. Distinctions between class, occupation, and sex, between technical skills on the one hand and the fine arts and the humanities on the other, between thought and action, culture and life. Even the critics of Brook Farm freely acknowledged its virtues and accomplishments. Hawthorne, who stayed there long enough to gather material for his devastating portraits in the Blithedale romance, honored his youthful dream of a noble and unselfish life, and looked back nostalgically on his socialist experience. Were my former associates now there, Hawthorne wrote, were there only 3 or 4 of those true-hearted men still laboring in the sun? I sometimes fancy that I should direct my world-weary footsteps thitherward, and entreat them to receive me for old friendship's sake. More and more I feel we struck upon what ought to be a truth. Posterity may dig it up and profit by it. And Emerson, who commented wittily on the concealed materialism of Brook Farm life, had to admit what accumulated culture many members owed to it, what mutual pleasures they took of each other. A close union like that in a ship's cabin, of persons in various conditions. Clergymen, young collegians, merchants, mechanics, farmers' sons and daughters, with men of rare opportunities and culture. But Brook Farm was unable to survive a serious crisis and went the way of the other phalanxes. On March 3, 1846, a fire demolished the nearly completed main building, or phalanstery. Its hopes had rested on this large unitary edifice, 170 feet long and 3 stories high, which was expected to attract scores of people and considerable amounts of capital. Further expansion was now out of the question. Demoralization quickly set in, and instead of new members entering Brook Farm the old members began leaving it. Meanwhile long-standing debts had to be paid off. Concluding that the situation was irreparable, the stockholders and creditors of the corporation quietly brought the experiment to a close in 1847. And so for the second time the apostles of utopian socialism were defeated in their attempt to transform the world by withdrawing from it. Their defeat was implicit in the act itself, their withdrawal from the world only testifying to their dependence on it. Associationism, after all, arose largely in response to a depression. With the return of prosperity in the mid-1840s the movement collapsed. But the cause of the collapse was not economic alone. A radical shift of moral emphasis was taking place in precisely those circles most drawn to communitarian ideals. To them the creation of righteous little communities, admirable in themselves, suddenly seemed trivial when weighed against such life and death questions as the spread of slavery and the disintegration of the country. The Owenite and Fourierist communities were American movements, though their theories originated in Europe. Icaria, the last of the major secular communities, was different. It was European, specifically French, through and through, in its personnel no less than in its theory. Icaria, then, might more accurately be classified with the religious sects than with the secular communities. It resembled the religious sects even in its longevity, lasting 46 years in the teeth of incredible hardships and suffering and intestine conflict. The founder of the sect, Etienne Cabot, was as much a prophet as Father Rapp or William Kyle. Born in Dijon in 1788, Cabot gave up a successful law practice in his hometown to join the underground Democrats of the Paris Carbonari Society. In 1834, Louis Philippe exiled him to England. There, after meeting and coming under the influence of Robert Owen, he decided to frame his own ideal society. He studied the writings of the great utopians, Plato, Thomas More, Campanella, Morelli, Mobley, as well as Fourier and Owen, and in 1840, a year after his return to France, published his Voyage en Icarie, Icare being the eponymous hero of the new order. The fictive Icaria conformed to the classic utopian model. It was communist rather than socialist. Property was held in common. Equality governed private life as absolutely as it did public. Individuals behaved with exemplary virtue, living as they did for the sake of the collectivity rather than for themselves, and censorship of ideas and news was rigorously enforced. At a time of burgeoning discontent among all classes in France, Voyage en Icarie found a large and responsive audience. By the mid-1840s, hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen were proclaiming themselves Icarians. In 1847, Cabot finally announced that he would establish an Icarian colony. It was a matter simply of putting an infallible scheme into effect. The response from his followers was immediate and overwhelming, and early the next year he bought a vast tract of land in Texas, enough to hold, on paper, untold thousands of settlers. The land was sold to him, however, on condition that it be occupied at once. Cabot hastily got together an advance guard of 69 adepts who sailed from France on the eve of the February Revolution. They were to take possession of the property, he and the others were to follow in due course. From the moment they arrived in New Orleans, disaster galled the Icarians every step of the way. After a harrowing 250-mile trek into the interior, they discovered that, for a variety of reasons, no communist community could be planted on the land Cabot had bought. They nonetheless built cabins and cultivated the earth. But the burdens were too onerous, and, their numbers reduced by death and defection, they returned to New Orleans. There they were met by Cabot and several hundred Icarians. A tiny fraction of the number he had expected would accompany him. Instead of claiming the land in Texas, he bought part of Nauvoo, Illinois, from the Mormons, who had recently abandoned it. In March 1849, 260 Icarians took over what once had been a thriving community. At first they throve, too, under a fairly democratic constitution that Cabot drew up, under pressure from the Illinois legislature. However, he himself was becoming more and more crotchety and authoritarian. Soon Icaria was rent into pro- and anti-Cabot factions. In 1856 a majority of his brethren ostracized him. Accompanied by a group of his faithful he left for St. Louis, determined as ever to create the true Icaria. But he died of a stroke only a few days after he arrived. His votaries carried out his wishes and built the community in a suburb of St. Louis. One schism followed another here too, and the second Icaria disintegrated in 1864. The original Icarians, meanwhile, unable to pay their debts, had moved to the trackless plains of southwest Iowa. There they struggled for years to raise a new colony. Though they did manage to establish a viable, never a prosperous, community, they could not overcome their propensity for factional discord. In time, a split developed between the generations, between the young, who sought reforms that would put the community in closer touch with modern reality, and the old, who refused to surrender the pristine values for which they had endured so much since the 1840s. In 1884 some of 84. Socialism in America, the young Icarians broke away and founded a community of their own, Icaria Esperanza, in Southern California. It closed down 3 years later. Icaria proper was now more an old-age home than a utopian society. Even so, it kept alive a form of socialism that history had long before consigned to the archives. Icaria was the fragile remains of an extinct species. Its passing in 1895 went practically unnoticed, a minor item in a local Iowa newspaper. The OWENITES. Cornelius C. Blatchly. An essay on Commonwealth * 1822. Hardly anything is known about Blatchly except that he went to the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons, and that he organized the New York Society for Propagating Communities. The excerpts below are taken from a copy in the Columbia University Rare Books collection. Let the uncultivated forests and prairies of western Fredonia be settled by Moravian, Episcopal, Methodistical, Presbyterian, and other communities of common stock. What time will be so suitable as the present? In a century more, these United States may be replenished with 100 millions of inhabitants, extending from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Such communities may now purchase the wilds, and settle together compactly, but this will not always be so. Let each community be founded on justice, wisdom, and love. Let love actuate wisdom, and let wisdom regulate justice in everything. Love, wisdom, and justice are human, or divine, temporal, or eternal. Where human justice is, there is political freedom, and where injustice is in dominion, there is religious freedom. Love to our neighbors as much as to ourselves should attach us to human justice, and love to God with all our hearts and minds should unite us to divine justice. Is it right that men in a social state should possess an equality of rights, privileges, and property in an inclusive way? We answer in the affirmative, and that in no systems of government can such an equality be produced, unless it be in a community of wealth and interest, and there only can liberty and equality exist in perfection. For social equality and social liberty cannot flourish in any society, country, or nation, where exclusive rights and Prop. pp. 24-26, 31-32, 35-38 exist. Indeed, how can social equality, liberty, and love flourish, where exclusive property generates the root of all evil, selfhood, or the spirit of selfishness, and love of money? Exclusive rights to wealth is the origin of greedy avarice and lustful covetousness. To obtain exclusive wealth and advantages, men and women are daily tempted to cheat, counterfeit, swindle, extort, oppress, steal, lie, deceive, rob, and murder. By usury, rents, and interest, they feed like drones on the labors of the industrious. To enjoy exclusive advantages, they have annually enslaved and caused the death of about 80,000 blacks from Africa. For these exclusive uses, men litigate, declare war, encourage piratical privateering, pillage, massacre, and destruction. We sincerely believe, we dare assert a paradox, that no man has a just right, though the laws of all governments have granted a legal right to exclusive property. To prove this assertion, we must consider whence social beings derive all they claim exclusively. That men would have remained in their natural state, unless civilized society had been instituted, is a self-evident proposition. In a state of nature, man would be in a worse condition than the savages, and could claim an exclusive title to nothing. His state would resemble the beasts of the forests. Hence the inference clearly arises, that all the property which men now possess exclusively, has been bestowed on them through the favor of social laws, privileges, customs, and advantages. In other words, that real and personal wealth is derived from, and is the gift of society. Joel Barlow says, society is the first proprietor and original cause of the appropriation of wealth. The gifts which society bestows belong to her before she gave them, and she is religiously obligated to use and bestow her blessings and donations in the most wise, just, equal, and social manner. In other words, the productions and wealth produced by society should not be individual, selfish, and exclusive property, but social and common benefit and wealth. We will illustrate this farther. Man in a natural, solitary, and unsocial state has no exclusive right, though a common right, to every natural thing the woods and waters afford him in his poor, weak, ignorant, and timorous condition. And, as the wild beasts would claim, and share dominion over the forests with such men in a state of nature, we conclude that men in an unsocial state would suffer, and often perish for the necessaries of life. As soon as men become social beings, they acquire wealth and power, and increase in wisdom, so that the secular communitarians 87 in the most civilized society, they have become very opulent, potent, and erudite. If men lived in pure and perfect communities, where all things were as they should be, man's social rights would not destroy, as they now do, the natural rights he possessed in his wild and unassociated state, but would increase, exalt, and perfect all his natural and social rights. And, as men claimed a right in their natural and unassociated state to everything around them, so they should claim, in a pure community, a right to all around them. No man by entering into civil government should be abridged of any equitable right of nature. Civil government should extend and enlarge every one of them. Life, liberty, and advantages should be inviolate, extended, and exalted. This is true, and paradoxical. Joel Barlow confirms these sentiments in his advice to privileged orders. Ch. 4, p. 76, and e. A pure commonwealth would put an end to the vast riches of a few, and the miserable indigence of many. All would have what Agur prayed for, when he said, "Give me neither poverty nor riches." Great wealth, as well as great penury, is a great evil, and produces luxury, sensuality, dissipation, vanity, pride, cruelty, oppression, hatred, and ruin. A pure commonwealth would put an end to the evils and oppressions of crafty rulers, and of lords temporal and of lords spiritual, and of all aristocrats, brokers, bankers, usurers, and knaves. It would terminate the numerous mischiefs framed into laws by crafty, ambitious, and selfish men and legislatures, such as tithes, taxes, imposts, absurdly called duties, excise, and stamp acts. Things which unjustly operate so as to make the poorer class of society pay the same price, for the same things, as the opulent, who are 100 times more able to bear it. The rich and poor, agreeable to dute, XVI. 17, ought to pay in proportion to their income and wealth. It would put an end to litigation, imprisonment for debt, and debtors' jails, and to pensioners, office hunters, war, and a hireling ministry. Indeed, what present evils of association would not cease to scourge us? Evils, by which men of opulence, office, learning and power now oppress the poor, weak, ignorant, servile and laborious parts of society, whose industry would, if society did them justice in her institutions and laws, produce them abundance. The moneyed and governing part of society have done, and still do, all they can to maintain and exalt themselves in affluence and dominion, and in indolence, luxury and underscore grandeur. Their great instruments of effecting these objects are 88. Socialism in America arms, and the exclusive rights of fealties, interests, rents and banks. Monopolies, imposts miscalled duties, and c. These enhance their exclusive opulence, by these they grind the poor to powder. We know of but 2 or 3 orders of governments among human beings. Inferior animals are governed most generally by instinct, affections, appetites, and passions, but men are associated and governed by, first, bestial, 2 ndly, human, or 3 rdly, divine influences. The government of men in an unassociated or natural state is likely to be too similar to inferior animals, but in their associated states, their governments may be generally said to be human or divine. Hence the reason may be seen why human governments are called in the scriptures, written by divine inspiration, kingdoms of this world, and why the divine government of men is called the kingdom of God and our Lord Jesus Christ. Of human governments, despotism is most bestial and passionate, and republicanism the most enlightened and rational. Of divine governments we have but a few national examples. One was the theocracy by Moses, which continued in some purity till the Israelites preferred and hailed Saul as their king. A divine government of mortals as far excels the human government of reason and philosophy, as this excels a government of bestial appetites and passions. Having shown that some things are held in common in every state of society, and that the more things are possessed in common, the more just and happy the state of society is, and that a community ruled by divine influences is infinitely better than any one that is administered by human reason and philosophy, because an infinitely holy, just, and beneficent God is the author, governor, and preserver of it. We might here conclude this address to your consciences and understanding by portraying the paradisiacal love, happiness, and harmony of a truly pious community. Here, a beautiful, enchanting, sublime, and delightful theme presents itself, wherein an orator, expatiating under divine influences, might induce us to engage ardently in promoting pious communities from every religious denomination of people, and cause the forests of nature and the wilds of society to bloom as gardens, where women would no longer be considered inferior to men, and men would love them as equals. Information and learning would abound. The youth would be nursed and bred with prudence, wisdom, and good associates. Civil and religious liberty, justice, and mercy would cause universal felicity, and God's will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. The secular communitarians 89 objections answered. Obj. 4. The learned, great, rich and potent characters of the world would never descend from their present superior situation and privileges, to be on a level with the lowest grade of mankind, to form communities where all would be in similar circumstances, as to wealth, and where they might be hindered in their pursuits of science, honor and dominion. Ans. The spirit of self is too visible in this objection to be mistaken. By nature all mankind are equal at their birth, and would continue much on an equality through life, if all human things were what they ought to be. For social rights, privileges and immunities ought to be common, equal and impartial. If some become superior to others by nature, art, opportunities and virtue, why should they be so selfish as to appropriate the advantages of their superiority to their private aggrandizement, in preference to public utility? Selfish love should not absorb social love. Men and their talents, whether natural or acquired, should be devoted to the benefit of all the world. When men are thus devoted, they are esteemed, and when their superior talents are thus applied, they are honored. The selfish man, to wit, the miser, the sensualist or niggard, is neither esteemed nor respected, because he prefers self to others. We should prefer the good of the world to that of our country, the good of our country to that of our families, and our families' good to our own benefit. Non nascimur nobis ipsis, i.e., we were not born to be selfish, was the Roman patriot's maxim, and Jesus Christ commanded to deny self, take up the cross, and follow him. Therefore, self-denial should be the Christian's maxim. If great, potent or learned men are not good and self-denying men, they are unfit, and would be injurious to our communities. If they were truly virtuous characters, and were convinced that a theocratical community was a natural paradise on earth, they would find it their duty and delight to descend to a just and common level of liberty and equality of rights and privileges, and assist with their talents and energies to promote peace, love, arts, science and felicity. A well-regulated and rightly established community could do more to advance and diffuse useful science and erudition among its male and female members than other kinds of society can now do. Lectures on chemistry, agriculture, mechanism, anatomy, surgery. Go. Socialism in America, botany, mineralogy, astronomy, physics, metaphysics, and other useful branches of erudition would be attended by adults and youth of both sexes. Females might give lectures to females, as well as men to men. They who assert that no rich men would join us, judge and condemn them all, as being selfish and uncharitable. Such a judgment is illiberal. We believe many opulent persons of both sexes are benevolent, charitable and bountiful to the poor and needy. We have seen their self-denial, and do fully believe them disposed to do whatever reason, revelation and conscience convince them to be right. They would, in such cases, sell all that self-possessed, take up the cross that crucifies self, and follow the Lamb of God. All who are selfish, whether they be rich men, or nobles on the earth, or very lean men, or ambitious heroes, would surely be out of their favorite element, were they to live in a disinterested community. But all who deny self, whether they be rich, noble, scientific or heroic, would delight to dwell in a self-denying community, where everyone is in the habit of denying self, to increase the good and happiness of others. The learned and virtuous Lord Chief Justice Hale says, in his discourse for employing the poor, that they that are rich are stewards of their wealth, and they that are wise are stewards of their wisdom, unto that great Master of the family of heaven and earth, to whom they must give an account of both. And one of the best accounts they can give of both is, to employ them in the relief and reformation of those that want both or either. Am I my brother's keeper? Was the answer of one of the worst of men. Obj. 5. Communities cannot prosper, some objectors say, because they are without the stimulus of selfish and exclusive interest, profit and honor, to excite them to industry, science and enterprise. This is advanced as a strong objection to any community. But facts disprove their theory. The Shakers are a very ingenious, neat, frugal, almsgiving and diligent people. So are the Harmonists and C. Moravians are a mild, patient and enterprising people. Ants, bees and beavers live in communities, and manifest unceasing diligence, art and enterprise. Then surely we ought to be wise enough to perceive, that true self-love and social, are the same. Besides this, social honor, social interest, and social felicity, are three as powerful motives in characters who are truly patriotic and self-denying, as selfish honor, interest and pleasure. The secular communitarians' incitements to labor, science and duty, exist in a community of pious people, than in any other kind of state. If men of piety did not prosper in communities, bees, ants and beavers would reprove and disgrace them. Mellish, in the journal of his travels, describes the happy, pious and flourishing community of the Harmonists. In the present governments which support the principle of selfishness, by encouraging exclusive titles to honor, profit and wealth, a few are very rich, and many are very poor. For many poor and suffering persons are necessary in society, to maintain one opulent man, surfeiting himself in the pleasures of this life. Riches are a snare of Satan, and the rich, like flies, are caught by him, in this his Sweden trap. Wise was the prayer of Agur. Give me, said he, neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me, lest I be full and deny thee, and say, Who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal, and take the name of my God in vain. We do not doubt that Agur would have been delighted in a pious community. Those who are rich, are generally the drones of the national hive. Were we like bees, what would become of them? 12 millions, or 3/4 of the population of Great Britain and Ireland are censused poor and working folks. The industrious and poor part of the society are really, though not nominally, in municipal slavery and degradation to the honored opulent. The poor labor too much. They are contemned. They cannot study the sciences. They mourn under their grievances. They perish under their hardships. What is their stimulus to labor? It is not for the accumulation of wealth, nor honor, nor the comforts of life. 3/4 of mankind are compelled, by dire necessity, to drudge and slave for an uncomfortable subsistence. But in a pious and pure community, such servitude, misery and oppression could not exist, neither would dronish lordlings. Men and women would labor diligently, but not continually. They would do so for health, happiness, competence, and a good conscience towards God and man. Part of their daily time would be occupied in the study of useful arts, sciences and literature. Every person should alternately strengthen the body by labor, and the mind by study. But in governments of exclusive property, most of the rich live without healthy bodily labor, and most of the poor and needy live without literary exercise. These views concerning the stimuli to exertion are sufficient to prove that men in pure communities have both greater and better excitements to be usefully employed in bodily and mental pursuits than those. 92. Socialism in America, who live in nations where property is held exclusively, and where the poor have only the lash of necessity to drive them. Besides these things, other stimuli or motives to good conduct might be enumerated, favorable to wise, just and pious associations with common stock. No militant and contending interests, for example, existing therein, as must necessarily exist in all governments, where wealth is held exclusively by individuals, they would enjoy in a community the loving sympathy and counsel of their brethren. How many unhappy persons, who now fail in their attempts to gain a competency, become disheartened for want of the friendly sympathy and counsel of their neighbors, whose interest, in the present state of society, is too frequently adverse. Again, the wise and virtuous smiles and approbation of a virtuous brotherhood of one common good, are stimuli to useful, ingenious, virtuous and noble deeds. Their approving smiles are purer, better, and superior to the smiles of a despot, to the honors of a monarchy, the rewards of a republic, or the plaudits of popular meetings. We may exultingly say of pure and pious communities, behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. How like the precious ointment upon the head, that ran down the beard of Aaron, that went down to the skirts of his garments. Ps. 133. Or, in the words of the poet, how pleasant 'tis to see kindred and friends agree. Each in their proper station move, and each fulfill their part, with sympathizing heart. In all the cares of life and love, 'tis like the ointment shed on Aaron's sacred head, divinely rich, divinely sweet. The oil through all the room diffused a choice perfume, ran through his robes and blessed his feet. We omit answering all such objections, as falsely presuppose and presume that our intended communities of interest shall be composed of the undevout and irreligious, as well as the pious and good, because their objections have no just reference to our prospects. Permit us to recommend a book called A New View of Society, by Robert Owen, belonging to the City Library of New York. He justly reprobates the extreme degree of selfishness which the IOEPI feudal and exclusive systems of conquerors and bigots have established in Europe, and which, in a high degree still exists to enslave men and minds. He advocates the common good education, character, and happiness of the community, and proves how they are the exaltation and glory of each individual. He has given a sketch of some of the errors and evils arising from the past and present state of society, with an explanation of some of the peculiar advantage to be derived from the arrangement of the unemployed working classes into agricultural and manufacturing villages of unity and interest, and mutual cooperation. He proves, by an example of 2,000 people or more, of very immoral habits, at Lanark, in Scotland, that communities of interest may be so managed, as to moralize even the worst of mankind, and make them happy. His work is a great encouragement for irreligious people to engage heartily in establishing communities for their individual health, benefit and happiness. We should be greatly gratified to see an American edition of his work in the hands of every philanthropist and politician. Where is charity's residence more evident than in a pure commonwealth? For their men are kind, and envy not, they vaunt not themselves, are not puffed up, do not behave unseemly. No one seeks his own, in a community, but every one promotes the general good. This is charity. Robert Owen, 3. First Discourse on a New System of Society 1825. This was the speech Owen delivered on February 25 in the Hall of Representatives, before the President-elect, heads of departments, members of Congress, etc. The subject which I shall now endeavor to explain is, without exception, the most important that can be presented to the human mind, and, if I have been enabled to take a right view of it, then are changes at hand greater than all the changes which have hitherto occurred in the affairs of mankind. But if, on the contrary, I have been deceived in my ardent, and earnest, and honest endeavors to discover truth for the benefit of my fellow men, then it behoves those distinguished individuals now before me and all, indeed, who are interested in the improvement of our species, to take the most effectual means to show wherein I am wrong. For believing, as I do most conscientiously, that the principles which I am about to explain are founded in fact, are in unison with all nature, and are abundantly competent to relieve society from its errors and evils, I must, while this conviction so remains, adopt every measure that my faculties and experience can suggest, to enable all men to receive the same impressions, and to act upon them. It is, therefore, no light duty that is about to devolve on those who are to direct the affairs of this extensive empire. For the time has come when they will have to decide, whether ignorance and poverty, and disunion and counteraction, and deception and imbecility, shall continue to inflict their miseries upon its subjects, or whether affluence and intelligence, and union and good feeling, and the most open sincerity in all things, shall change the condition of this population, and give continually increasing prosperity to all the states, and secure happiness to every individual within them. And * New Harmony Gazette, April 1825, May 2, 1827. This is but a part, and a small part of the responsibility with which they cannot avoid being invested, for it is not merely the 10 or 12 millions who are now in these states who will be injured or essentially benefited by their decisions, but their neighbors in the Canadas, in the West Indies, and over the whole continent of South America, will be almost immediately affected by the measures that shall be adopted here. Nor will their responsibility be limited within this new Western world. The influence of their proceedings will speedily operate most powerfully upon the governments and people of the Old World. If, upon a fair and full examination of the principles which I am to present to you, they shall be found true and most beneficial for practice, those who are appointed to administer the general affairs of the Union, and of the respective states of which it is composed, will have to decide upon the adoption of measures to enable the people of this continent to enjoy the advantages which those principles and practices can secure to them and to their posterity. And, through long experience, I am prepared to say that the advantages to be derived from these principles and practices will be superior to any now possessed by any people, so that, if the governments of the old world do not gradually alter their institutions, so as to permit the subjects of their respective states to partake of similar benefits, then will the population of the old world come to the new. For, within its limits, from north to south, there is an abundance of capacity to sustain and support, in high comfort, much more than all the present population of the old world. Therefore, the ruler of these states, in coming to a decision on this subject, will have to decide upon the destinies of the human race, both in this and in future generations. The knowledge which I possess upon this subject has been derived from reading and reflection, from practice, and from personal communication. To make myself acquainted with the facts to be collected from the past history of our species, I read, in my early life, at least 5 hours each day, on an average of 20 years. This reading was in English, the only language I have acquired, and I know it but imperfectly. 96. Socialism in America Ments, which have now continued, without intermission, for nearly 35 years. Oh, to make myself quite sure that I could not be deceived in the truth of these principles, in the results of the experiments, or in the advantages to be derived from their universal application to practice, I have employed a considerable portion of each year, of the last 12, to mix freely with all descriptions of society, and to communicate, in person, confidentially, with the leaders of the various classes, sects, and parties, to be found in my own country, and in the most civilized parts of Europe. I have also, in the same manner, communicated with many strangers, of every rank and condition, who came as visitors from different parts of the world, to examine the results of the experiments which I commenced, more than 25 years ago, at New Lanark, in Scotland, where they continue in daily successful progress. Among these strangers not a few were from this country, for the experiments were made for the benefit of mankind, and they have ever been open to inspection of all my fellow creatures, from every quarter of the world. The result of such reading, reflection, experiments, and personal communication, has been to leave an irresistible impression on my mind, that society is in error, that the notions on which all its institutions are founded are not true, that they necessarily generate deception and vice, and that the practices which proceed from them are destructive of the happiness of human life. The reflections which I was enabled to make upon the facts which the history of our race presented to me, led me to conclude that the great object intended to be attained, by the various institutions of every age and country, was, or ought to be, to secure happiness for the greatest number of human beings. That this object could be obtained only, first, by a proper training and education from birth, of the physical and mental powers of each individual. Second, by arrangements to enable each individual to procure in the best manner at all times, a full supply of those things which are necessary and the most beneficial for human nature. And third, that all individuals should be so united and combined in a social system, as to give to each the greatest benefit from society. These are, surely, the great objects of human existence. Yet the facts conveyed to us by history and the experience of the present 97 assure us that no arrangements have been formed, that no institutions exist, even to this hour, competent to produce these results. For, is it not a fact, that, at this moment, ignorance, poverty, and disunion pervade the earth? Are not these evils severely felt in those countries esteemed the most civilized? Do they not now abound in those nations in which the arts and sciences and general knowledge, and wealth and political power, have made the most rapid and extensive progress? Then, permit me to ask, why have these plain and simple, yet most important objects, not been attained? Why has so little progress been made in the road to substantial happiness? My reading and reflection induced me to conclude, that man continued degraded, and poor, and miserable, because he was forced, by the prejudices of past time, to remain ignorant of his own nature, and, in consequence, that he had formed institutions not in unison, but in opposition to it, and thence proceeded the conflict between the supposed duty and his nature. To aid me in discovering whether this conclusion was true or false, my attention was turned to the examination of facts calculated to assist in forming a right judgment upon the subject. A steady and persevering examination of these facts confirmed the early impression made by reading and reflection. The records of history informed me that human nature had been governed by force and fraud, and that a general conviction prevailed that it could not be otherwise controlled with safety or benefit to itself. Yet, from the most impartial consideration I could give to the past transactions of mankind, I was obliged to conclude that those principles of government proceeded from error regarding the real constitution of human nature. It seemed to me that a government founded on justice, kindness, and sincerity, as soon as the world could be induced to admit of sincerity in its transactions, would be one more suited to human nature, and much more likely to improve the condition of any people. To enable me to ascertain the truth or error of these suppositions, at the age of 18 I commenced a series of experiments upon a limited population. At that period circumstances occurred which placed 500 persons, men, women, and children, under my management, and from that time to this, I have had from 500 to 2,500, the present number, under my immediate direction. Without any regard to the previous character of these people, I. 98. Socialism in America determined to govern them upon principles of strict justice and impartial kindness. I wished, also, to have adopted a system of open sincerity with all of them, but the irrational state of their minds, of those around them, and of the public at large, at that period, rendered such a proceeding impracticable, and the attempt to introduce a practice so new and strange to the world, would have destroyed my usefulness. I was therefore, by the force of circumstances, compelled to reflect much, to speak little, and to practice extensively, and these were my habits during the first 20 years of these experiments. In all that period I did not intrude one sentence upon the world, for I deemed it a duty to make myself quite sure of the truth of all the principles upon which I acted, before I recommended them for the adoption of others. But, during that period, I had a full opportunity of proving the truth and value of the principles which had governed my conduct. These principles enabled me to proceed, from one step of success to another, until more was accomplished than the world deemed possible to attain in practice. Many would not believe, on any testimony, that such results could be produced, until they came to examine the facts for themselves, and even then it was with difficulty they admitted the evidence of their own senses, many of them exclaiming with astonishment, "The beings before me do not appear to belong to the human nature I have been accustomed to see, or with which I have previously associated." They saw a population that had been indolent, dirty, imbecile, and demoralized, to a lamentable extent, who had become actively industrious, cleanly, temperate, and very generally moral, in all their proceedings. They saw the children of these people trained and educated, from 2 years of age and upwards, without individual reward or punishment. And they had never seen children who were their equals in disposition, habits, manners, intelligence, and kind feelings, or who appeared to enjoy an equal degree of active happiness. Yet this population had been so changed by an unknown and uneducated individual, without fortune and friends, and in opposition to almost every conceivable obstacle that the prejudices derived from ages of ignorance could unite, and while, comparatively, a few only of the circumstances most favorable to their well-being and happiness could be combined for their improvement. It may now be the wish of many to inquire, whence this influence? Wherein does its efficacy consist? And by what unheard of means, or magic power, are these beneficial, yet strange results, now brought to pass? I reply, by means the most natural, obvious, and simple, and the knowledge of which we obtain from the facts around us. From facts, too, which have been familiar to man in every stage of his existence, and which, as they are derived from the direct evidence of our senses, no intelligent mind will now dispute. For, is it not a fact, in accordance with the direct evidence of our senses, that infants at birth are ignorant of themselves, and of all things around them? Is it not a fact, that they are unconscious how their senses were formed, or any part of their organization was generated or produced? Is it not a fact, that the senses and organization of no two infants have ever been known to be alike, although all possess the same general principles of human nature, and that no two individuals have ever been made the same, although trained and educated under apparently similar external circumstances? Is it not a fact, that all infants are most powerfully influenced by the general and particular external circumstances which exist around them at birth, and through childhood and youth, to manhood? Is it not a fact, that these circumstances may be so varied as to give an almost infinite variety of character to any infants, on principles as fixed and certain as those on which any of the sciences are founded, and that, by such varied circumstances, any, or all infants, may be trained to become ignorant or intelligent, cruel or humane, selfish or liberal, a cannibal or Hindu, a miserable being, or one whose existence shall be a life of happiness? Is it not a fact, that all infants are capable of being formed by the overwhelming influence of circumstances, acting upon their original individual nature, into any of these characters, provided their physical and mental organization be not imperfect, and that, in such case, as nature has been disturbed in her process, that the beings thus injured, physically or mentally, become objects for compassion and for increased care and kindness, in proportion to their malformation? And is it not a clear and evident deduction from these facts, that those who govern society possess the power, if they knew how to use it, to combine and regulate the circumstances which ought to influence and form the character of every individual of the NSING generation? 100. Socialism in America ends, intelligence, virtue, and happiness, throughout the whole population. These are living facts, confirmed by the history of every nation and people, and they are in strict accordance with whatever we know from the evidence of our own senses. And it was in consequence of acting upon the belief in the truth of these facts, that the characters of those placed under my direction were so much changed for the better, and that their condition has been so materially improved. With the knowledge of these facts, I could not be angry or displeased with any of those placed under my guidance on account of any original personal defects, for to me it was evident they could not have had the slightest influence in producing them. Neither could I be angry or displeased with them, on account of the injuries which they might have received from being surrounded with unfavorable circumstances, over which they could have no control, but which circumstances formed their language, dispositions, habits, sentiments, religion, feelings, and conduct. If these were defective and inferior, they necessarily created in my mind compassion for their misfortunes, and my thoughts were employed in discovering the circumstances which produced these unfavorable effects, and all my efforts were directed to remove them, and to replace them by others having a beneficial tendency. Having discovered that individuals were always formed by the circumstances, whatever they might be which were allowed to exist around them, my practice was to govern the circumstances, and thus, by means imperceptible and unknown to the individuals, I formed them, to the extent I could control the circumstances, into what I wished them to become. And in this manner were the beneficial changes effected in the population under my care. In this process I could not be disappointed, for I did not expect any evil to disappear, until I had removed the cause or causes which produced it. Nor will evil of any kind ever be excluded from society, until the cause which gives it existence shall be discovered and removed. Here, then, have we before us the natural means by which, on sure grounds, society may be made virtuous, and immediately improved, to an extent that no one can limit, and, by a similar practice, the causes which generate all the inferior motives, and, consequently, actions of man, may be easily withdrawn, and, by the same means, the secular communitarians 101 universal charity, benevolence, and kindness, may be made to become the ruling principles in the government of mankind. With the knowledge of the facts which I have enumerated, relative to the constitution of human nature, the error and childishness of praising and blaming each other, and of devising rewards and punishments, and of applying them, through a gross ignorance of our nature, to particular individuals, must become too obvious to admit of their longer continuance among those who have any teal pretensions to rationality. For what shall we praise or blame each other? Not, surely, for our personal qualifications, which we had no will in forming. Still less for being born within the circle in which Jewish, Christian, Mohammedan, or any other general impressions are, at an early age, forced into our minds. Or do we praise and blame each other because we have come into existence a member of any particular sect, class, or party, in any country within either of these large circles which now so effectually divide man from his fellow man, and, in consequence, make him one of the most unjust and irrational of all beings? Or shall we praise or blame each other because we have been born of rich or poor, virtuous or vicious parents, or because the more or less favorable circumstances, existing in the place of our birth and training, made the population around us more or less wise or foolish, strong or weak? Or shall we praise or blame each other for any conceivable combination of our personal or acquired advantages or disadvantages? In this irrational conduct, behold the real cause of almost all the evils that have ever afflicted humanity, save those extraordinary overwhelming dispensations of Providence, which seldom occur, and soon pass away. Man, through ignorance, has been, hitherto, the tormentor of man. He is here, in a nation deeming itself possessed of more privileges than all other nations, and which pretensions, in many respects, must be admitted to be true. Yet, even here, where the laws are the most mild, and consequently the least unjust and irrational, individuals are punished even to death, for actions which are the natural and necessary effects arising from the injurious circumstances which the government and society, to which they belong, unwisely permit to exist. While other individuals are almost as much injured by being as unjustly rewarded for performing actions for which, as soon as they 102. Socialism in America shall become rational beings, they must be conscious they cannot be entitled to a particle of merit. It is true that, from obvious causes, the great mass of the people, in all countries, have been so trained by the circumstances around them, that they have been forced, unknown to themselves, to receive notions which are opposed to the great and important truths which I have placed before you, and, in consequence, the most lamentable ignorance of human nature universally prevails, and poverty, and injustice, and vice, and misery, at this hour, everywhere superabound. Vast numbers of men, and more particularly women, in all countries have been forced, from generation to generation, to receive in infancy, as true, various imaginary notions, long prevalent in those countries, and they have been taught that their happiness or misery depended upon their belief or disbelief in the truth of those notions. In various countries, these notions differ materially. In some they are in direct opposition to others, and, as all are trained to think that the notions taught in their own country are so true that it is impossible they can be deceived, and that those in opposition to them are so false that none but the most ignorant and weak will be made to believe in them, and that such false and wicked notions must produce vicious conduct, every imaginable bad feeling that can be implanted in human nature is generated and fostered. National, sectarian, and individual antipathies necessarily follow, division and counteraction of every description succeed, and the world is thus forced to become a chaotic scene of confusion, disorder, and misery. It is so at this moment, and strange to say, it has been made to be so through those original qualities of our nature, which, whenever they shall be rightly directed, and justice shall be done to them, will produce the fullness of charity, and kindness, and sincerity, from each to all, until we shall become, in fact, and in reality, a new people, having but one common interest. And then all the benefits of the world will be freely open to every one, and in consequence, all will be gainers, to an extent that no imagination has been yet trained to be competent to conceive. The original faculties of our nature, which have been thus abused, are the natural love of truth, and the desire to benefit our fellow creatures to the greatest possible extent. These are the genuine feelings which now actuate the conscientiously religious in all the countries throughout the world. These are the sole motives which animated the real religious of all the past times, and which gave an inexpressible pleasure to the dying moments of martyrs of all sects, in every age and country. Why should these inestimable qualities of the human mind be longer abused, and forced to become the instruments of universal discord, confusion, and suffering? Is it wise in those that govern to allow this wretched error to continue? Are there not men around me, even now, in the actual possession of tenfold more power and influence than are requisite to stem this torrent of error and misdirection of the finest feelings and best faculties of our nature? I know there are, and I trust they will now manfully and promptly step forward, and place themselves in the gap between the present and the future, and from this capital, in their collective capacity say to the world, now shall the government of force, and fraud, and disunion cease, and from henceforth, truth, and sincerity, and charity, and kindness, and union, shall take their place, and superstition and prejudice shall no longer have dominion here. This is the mighty deed that the intelligent part of the population of this country, and the enlightened men among all the nations of the earth, will expect at their hands. And can any position be conceived so important, or, at this moment, so highly to be desired, for the accomplishment of the greatest good to this country and to the world, as that to which the new administration of this empire has been just appointed? Knowing well the favorable circumstances which, in the most extraordinary manner, have been combined, and are in full force to aid its attainment, I conjure them, on account of their own feelings and reflections, but I conjure them, most particularly in the name of those innumerable beings throughout the world, who are now afflicted with penury and want, with ignorance, and vice, and superstition, with the inferior motives which have been instilled into their minds from infancy, and the consequent misery which they suffer, that they will not allow this inestimable opportunity to escape. If the leading men of these states, forgetting every little and unworthy party and sectarian distinction, will now cordially unite, they may, with ease, break asunder the bonds of ignorance, superstition, and prejudice, and by thus acting they could not fail to dispel error, and to give and secure mental freedom and happiness to the world. To effect this change, the greatest ever yet made in human affairs, no sacrifice on their parts will be necessary. If they, 104, Socialism in America possess, as I trust they do, sufficient moral courage to will this deed, and without delay to express that will openly and decisively to the world, then will mental slavery soon cease everywhere, and the victory over ignorance and poverty, and sin, and misery will be achieved. Here, fortunately for you and for the future destinies of the human race, no legal power sustains ignorance, error and superstition, and without such support, what chance of success can those have in opposition to the most obvious facts around us? The government and Congress of this new empire have only now, as I have previously stated, to will this change, and it will be at once effected, and by such act, they will give and secure liberty, affluence, and happiness, to America and to the world. I have said, give liberty to America, but the natives of this empire have been taught to believe, that they already possess full liberty. I know it is not so, and in proof of this denial, permit me to ask, how many present feel they possess the power to speak their real sentiments, freely and openly, on subjects the most important to themselves and to the well-being of society? Until this can be done, and done without any disadvantage whatever to those who do it, liberty has not been attained, and you have yet to work out for yourselves this, the most precious and valuable part of liberty. Many must be now conscious that they are to a great extent under the despotism of weak minds, who are themselves the slaves of superstition and prejudice. Until human beings shall, without any inconvenience whatever, speak openly and frankly the genuine impression of their mind on all subjects, they must be considered to be in a state of mental bondage, and in that condition all men have ever yet been, and to a greater extent perhaps, than you suspect, you are so even now. By a hard struggle you have attained political liberty, but you have yet to acquire real mental liberty, and if you cannot possess yourselves of it, your political liberty will be precarious and of much less value. The attainment of political liberty is, however, a necessary step towards the acquirement of real mental liberty, and as you have obtained the former, I have come here to assist you to secure the latter. For without mental liberty, there can be no sincerity, and without sincerity, devoid of all deception, there can be no real virtue or happiness among mankind. My desire now is to introduce into these states, and through them to the world at large, a new social system, formed in practice of an entire new combination of circumstances, all of them having a direct underscore. The secular communitarian's 105 moral, intellectual, and beneficial tendency, fully adequate to effect the most important improvements throughout society. This system has been solely derived from the facts relative to our common nature, which I have previously explained. In this new social arrangement, a much more perfect system of liberty and equality will be introduced than has yet anywhere existed, or been deemed attainable in practice. Within it there will be no privileged thoughts or belief. Everyone will be at full liberty to express the genuine impressions which the circumstances around them have made on their minds as well as their own undisguised reflections thereon, and then no motive will exist for deception or insincerity of any kind. Everyone will be instructed in the outline of all the real knowledge which experience has yet discovered. This will be effected on a plan in unison with our nature, and by which the equality of the mental faculties will be rendered more perfect, and by which all will be elevated much above what any can attain under the existing despotism of mind. And by these arrangements the general intellect of society will be enabled to make greater advances in a year than it has been hitherto allowed to attain in a century. The innumerable and incalculable evils and absurdities which have arisen from the inequality of wealth will be effectually overcome and avoided throughout all the future. By arrangements, as simple and desirable as they will be beneficial for everyone, all will possess, at all times, a full supply of the best of everything for human nature, as far as present experience on these matters can direct our knowledge. The degrading and pernicious practices in which we are now trained, of buying cheap and selling dear, will be rendered wholly unnecessary, for, so long as this principle shall govern the transactions of men, nothing really great or noble can be expected from mankind. The whole trading system is one of deception, one by which each engaged in it is necessarily trained to endeavor to obtain advantages over others, and in which the interest of all is opposed to each, and in consequence, not one can attain the advantages that, under another and a better system might be, with far less labor, and without risk, secured in perpetuity to all. The consequence of this inferior trading system is to give a very 106. Socialism in America injurious surplus of wealth and power to the few, and to inflict poverty and subjection on the many. In the new system, union and cooperation will supersede individual interest in the universal counteraction of each other's objects. And, by the change, the powers of one man will obtain for him the advantages of many, and all will become as rich as they will desire. The very imperfect experiments of the Moravians, Shakers and Harmonites give sure proof of the gigantic superiority of union over division, for the creation of wealth. But these associations have been hitherto subject to many disadvantages, and their progress and success have been materially counteracted by many obstacles which will not exist under a system founded on a correct knowledge of the constitution of our nature. We cannot fail to be alive to the superiority of combined over individual efforts, when applied to destroy. We all know the increased power acquired by a small army, united, and acting as one body, over the same number of men acting singly and alone. And if such advantages can be gained by union to destroy, why should it not be applied to our benefit for civil purposes? The new combinations proposed will be associations of men possessing real religious and mental liberty, with every means for obtaining great mental acquirements, and these, it is expected, will rapidly increase among all the members. Under this system, real wealth will be too easily obtained in perpetuity and full security to be much longer valued as it now is by society, for the distinctions which it makes between the poor and rich. For, when the new arrangements shall be regularly organized and completed, a few hours daily of healthy and desirable employment, chiefly applied to direct modern mechanical and other scientific improvements, will be amply sufficient to create a full supply, at all times, of the best of everything for everyone, and then all things will be valued according to their intrinsic worth, will be used beneficially, and nothing will be wasted or abused. I did expect, before this time, to have received from Europe models, upon a large scale, of these new combinations, and, without which, it is difficult to comprehend that which is so wholly new in principle and practice to you. The Secular Communitarians 107 ing, for the inspection of any parties who may wish to examine them. Well knowing the great extent of these advantages, my wish now is to give them, in the shortest time, to the greatest number of my fellow creatures, and that the change from the present erroneous practices should be effected, if possible, without injury to a human being. With this view, I am prepared to commence the system on my own private responsibility, or with partners having the same principles and feelings with myself, or by joint stock companies, under an act of incorporation from the state governments of Indiana and Illinois, in which the new properties which I have purchased, with a view to these establishments, are situated, or, by a general incorporated company, formed of the leading persons in each state, who could easily form arrangements by which the benefit of the system might be obtained, with the least loss of time, by all the inhabitants within each government, belonging to the Union. Improbable, and impracticable, as I well know it must appear to you, and to the mass of the public, I do not hesitate to state confidently from this chair, from which you have been accustomed to hear so many important truths, that the system which I am about to introduce into your states, is fully competent to form them into countries of palaces, gardens, and pleasure grounds, and, in one generation, to make the inhabitants a race of very superior beings. When the principles on which this new system is founded, and the practices to which they will necessarily lead, shall be so investigated as to be fully understood, it will be discovered that the present system of society must almost immediately give way before it. The principles of human nature, on which its morals are founded, will render union and cooperation, to any extent, not only easy, but delightful in practice. The pecuniary effects which will be produced by union and cooperation, will make the division and combinations of labor, in the same persons and interest, complete, and, in consequence, all individual competition must prove unavailing, and cause loss of time and capital. I am therefore desirous that the knowledge of this change being about to commence, should be speedily known over the Union, that as little capital as possible should be lost by its application to objects which might be rendered of no value by the new measures which may be soon carried into extensive execution in all the states. 108. Socialism in America. Many, who have partially considered this subject, and who are converts to the principles, and fully alive to the benefits to be derived from the practice, are, nevertheless, impressed with the belief that the system can advance but slowly, as other great changes have been effected. This supposition is very natural, it is in unison with the experience of the past, but their minds have not yet had time to expand to the full extent of this subject, and to discover how different its character is from all former changes. These have been merely an alteration of the mode of acting, while the fundamental principles remained untouched. But, in the present case, there will be an entire change of the fundamental principles on which society has proceeded in all countries, from the earliest period of which we possess knowledge, to the present. Compared with the mighty consequences which must flow from this change, all former revolutions in human affairs scarcely deserve a name. This is a revolution from a system in which individual reward and punishment has been the universal practice, to one, in which individual reward and punishment will be unpracticed and unknown, except as a grievous error of a past wretched system. On this account, my belief has long been, that, wherever society should be fully prepared to admit of one experiment on the new system, it could not fail to be also prepared to admit the principle from which it has been derived, and to be ready for all the practice which must emanate from the principle, and, in consequence, that the change could not be one of slow progression, but it must take place at once, and make an immediate, and almost instantaneous, revolution in the minds and manners of the society in which it shall be introduced. Unless we can imagine that there are human beings who prefer sin and misery to virtue and happiness. Let the subject be sifted and examined with the most scrutinizing care and caution, and it will prove to be as I have now stated. The truth is, that the great principle on which the new system rests, is directly opposed to that on which old society has been founded. They lead to the same opposition in practice, and there is not the slightest connection between them, nor is it possible they can long exist together. For, whenever these two principles shall be brought into fair and open competition, one or other must speedily prove to be false, and a mere notion of the imagination. The one attributes merit and demerit to belief. The other gives. The secular communitarians 109 neither merit nor demerit to any belief, because belief has never been under the will or control of man. The one generates in man anger and irritation, because his fellow man differs from him in sentiments, habits, and feelings. The other instructs how men are necessarily made to differ in color, in language, in habits, in sentiments, in religion, in feeling, and in conduct, and thereby implants in every one the principle of universal charity, benevolence, and kindness, and withdraws all anger from the human constitution. The one separates man from man, individualizing the human race, and thereby creating endless causes of division and opposition of interest and of feeling, and thus generates and fosters all the inferior motives and bad passions and actions which have ever pervaded society. The other forms man at once into a rational being, and, by removing every cause of dislike and jealousy, prepares the most effectual means to unite him with his fellows, and to combine them in one general system of action for their mutual benefit. In short, the one is, in reality, an imaginary notion, which has ever been impressed in infancy on the mind of the human race, in direct opposition to every known fact. A notion derived solely from the ignorance of the darkest ages, and which has so perverted the human faculties, as, with slight exceptions, to keep the whole race of men almost continually involved in war and violence, in direct opposition to the real interest of every individual. While the other is a principle derived from experience, in unison with all facts, past and present, a principle which deprecates all war and violence, and punishment of every kind, which harmonizes every feeling and faculty of the human mind, rendering it rational and humane, and uniting all in one bond of interest and affection. Therefore, between this principle and this imaginary notion, there can be no resemblance whatever. They must abjure each other, the one being the cause of all happiness to man, the other of all misery. And the time is now come, when the principle of good is about to predominate and reign triumphant over the principle of evil, and when, in consequence, society may be most easily arranged to exist without ignorance or poverty, or vice, or crime, or misery. It is to effect this change that I am here this night, that, if possible, a mortal blow shall be now given to the fundamental error which, till now, has governed this wretched world, and inflicted unnumbered cruelties and miseries upon its inhabitants. The time has passed, within the present hour, when this subject can be. 110. Socialism in America no longer smothered or hidden from the public mind of this country. It must now be open to the most free discussion, and I well know what will be the result. At this time a match has been applied to a train, that, if I mistake not, will dispel past errors, until old things shall pass away, and all shall become new, and beautiful, and delightful, bringing unnumbered and unlimited blessings to every one. I trust this subject now appears paramount to every other, and that the necessity for a speedy examination of it, by the highest authorities, is equally evident. Placed as it now is before the public, a day ought not to be lost in stamping it with its proper terms of truth or falsehood. The system now advocated can be of no equivocal character. It must be full of benefit or of evil to you all. I therefore beseech you, for your sakes, and for the public benefit, to ascertain its value, that the people may know whether I have brought them a vision to amuse them, or a substantial blessing. To effect this object, may I be permitted to suggest, competent persons be appointed, under the name of commissioners, or committee, or any other name, to examine the whole subject, a mere outline of which, in this discourse, has been hastily and slightly sketched. That, after such examination, the parties appointed to investigate, make a report for the satisfaction of the public, whose interests are so deeply involved in the result. In what has been said I have endeavored to show, that the subject I have introduced, is the most important that can engage the attention of mankind, that the cause of all past and present evil in society is the notion that there can be merit or demerit in any belief whatever, that this error generates all the bad passions, keeps them in perpetual activity, produces nothing but unhappiness to the human race, and that, while it shall be allowed to rationalize each succeeding generation, sin and misery must have dominion over the world. I have stated, also, that by the undeviating constitution of our common nature, each individual has hitherto been formed by the circumstances which have been allowed to exist around him from birth to manhood, that these circumstances have been uniformly opposed to our constitution, and, consequently, of a very injurious character, producing only various degrees of vice and misery. I afterwards explained what appeared to me to be the real constitution. PDASOTE plus. The secular communitarians 111 of our nature and state, that, when circumstances shall be judiciously combined by those who have acquired an accurate knowledge of it, that each individual of our species, without a single exception, may be trained to become virtuous, intelligent, and happy, to a degree much exceeding what has been experienced under the old system of society in any part of the world. And thus far only time allows me to proceed on the present occasion. That which requires yet to be explained, to enable the public to form a right judgment of the entire system now advocated, is a detail of the circumstances which, in combination, are to possess sufficient power to produce the extraordinary results which I have promised, and a development of the means by which, without injury to anyone, they can be carried without delay into national and general practice, so as to give, almost immediately, many of the benefits of the change to the whole population of the Union, by relieving them from poverty or the fear of it, and very soon, from ignorance, and all the lamentable effects which these two evils necessarily produce. Francis Wright. Statement on Neshoba * 1826. Francis Wright appended this statement to a deed giving control of Neshoba to a group of trustees, among them Owen and Lafayette. In attempting an institution in the United States, for the benefit of the Negro race, I was fully aware that much assistance would be necessary, before anything of importance could be effected. To secure a title to this assistance, I have ever felt it requisite, that some guarantee should be given to the public, not merely for the sincerity of my intentions, but for my probable chance of success. The mode that most naturally present itself, on the first view of the subject, is to place the institution, by some legal arrangement, under the management of some public body, and to appoint trustees subject to the control of that body. The objections to this mode are, I conceive, substantial. There is no public body, with which I am acquainted, that is not, and must not of necessity be, by the political constitutions of the country, a representative of the feelings of a majority of the nation. In these feelings, as regards the object I have in view, the benefit of the Negro race, no reflecting individual can or ought to repose confidence. Every part of the United States feels, more or less, the contamination of slavery. The Negro race is everywhere, more or less, held, by a great majority of the population, in contempt and suspicion. Its very color is an object of disgust. And in the speeches and votes of Congress, we find an evidence that the most northern sections of the country harbor prejudices, equal in strength to those of the extreme South. Next to the national securities, apparently offered by the legislatures and official characters of the states, some more private associations or bodies seem to present themselves, such as the * New Harmony Gazette, February 21, 1827. The secular communitarians 213 Emancipation and Colonization Societies. In the former of these, I could alone suppose any real sympathy of feeling, as, however excellent the intentions of many members of the colonization societies, I cannot but consider the essence of the institution to be favorable to slavery, as they tend, rather to relieve the slaveholders from some of those inconveniences which might force them to abandon their system, than to effect a change in that system itself. The names of many of the presidents and directors of these societies will sufficiently bear testimony to the justice of this observation. In the members of the emancipating societies, I acknowledge with pleasure, the real friends of the liberty of man. And my only reason for not placing this property in some way or other, under their control, is that I conceive their views, respecting the moral instruction of human beings, to differ, essentially, from my own. This moral instruction I hold to be of even greater importance than the simple enfranchisements from bodily slavery, inasmuch as the liberty of the mind, and the just training of the thoughts and feelings, can alone constitute a free man, and a useful member of society. My inquiries and observations have led me to believe that the benevolence of the societies alluded to is based on, or connected with, peculiar tenets of religion, and that the management of any individuals, who should not take these for their guide, would naturally be disapproved, and probably interrupted. Let nothing unfriendly be found in these observations. I respect and esteem the intentions of the societies spoken of, and only differ from them in opinion. This difference of opinion, however, we both agree in considering of the first importance. There being, thus, two objects to be attained, the giving some guarantee to the public, that the institution will not be perverted to the private interest of an individual, and the possessing some security for myself and friends, that such guarantee will not endanger our ultimate views of moral regeneration. It has been felt necessary to have recourse to sureties of a still more private nature, which alone seem to embrace the desired objects. Let us place trust and responsibility where we will, we must still place it in men, and our security must ever principally rest on a belief in their integrity, and a knowledge of their feelings and opinions. In consequence, I have made choice of a certain number of individuals in whom 114. Socialism in America and, failing them, in others, chosen as before mentioned, the possession and management of this property, in trust for a certain object, is vested. I am fully aware that by this expression of sentiments, different from those commonly received in the world, the institution will forfeit much assistance which it might otherwise obtain. But I hold a plain expression of opinion to be not only a right, but a duty, and that in the exercise of this duty, every individual not only best consults his own dignity, but renders the most important of all services to mankind. Emancipation based on religion has hitherto effected but little, and, generally speaking, has by the tone and arguments employed, tended rather to irritate than convince. In facing the subject of slavery, it is necessary to bear in mind the position of the master, equally with that of the slave, bred in the prejudices of color and authority, untaught to labor, and viewing it as a degradation. We should consider that what we view, at first sight, as a peculiar vice and injustice, is not more so, in fact, than any other vice and injustice, stamped by education on the minds and hearts of other men. We must come to the slaveholders, therefore, not in anger, but in kindness, and when we ask him to change his whole mode of life, we must show him the means by which he may do so, without the complete compromise of his ease and of his interests. There are comparatively few holders of slaves, who will not admit in argument the worst evils of the system, more particularly the idleness, violent passions, and profligacy, it but too generally fixes on their children. But, they will say, what can we do? We are unfit for labor, and are dependent, for our very subsistence, on the labor of the Negro. Let us then, propose to them to unite their property, to pursue such occupations as their previous habits may bend to, and to continue to impose the harder tasks of labor, during their lives or necessities, upon the present generation of slaves, conferring such an education on the children of their slaves, as shall fit them for the station of a free people. Let them, at the same time, train their own children in the habits worthy of free men, rendering them independent of the labor of others, by a complete and practical education, that shall strengthen the body equally with the mind, render just and amiable the opinions and feelings, and introduce at once, in a new generation, that complete equality of habits in the secular communitarians 115 knowledge, alone consistent with the political institutions of the country. In this place, the trustees will be found ready to enter into such terms with the owners of slaves, as shall forward the object above specified. It must be understood, however, that here is no invitation to the slaveholder in feeling and obstinate habit. None can be received, who do not come with the feeling of good will to all men, and who, regretting the prejudices of their own education, shall not desire, for their children, one of a completely opposite character. No difference will be made in the schools between the white children and the children of color, whether in education or any other advantage. What degree of assistance this infant institution may receive must depend on the amount of sympathy, scattered throughout the world, with the views and feelings expressed in this paper. To those acknowledging such sympathy, the paper is addressed. Those who have money or other property will bring it. They who have only their arms or their heads will bring them. To secure this assistance cheerfully and lastingly, it is necessary that the independence of every individual should be secured, beyond the possibility of interruption. Without such security, human exertions must be feeble, and human happiness incomplete. Perfect independence, and entire exemption from all anxiety respecting the future, both as regards the parents themselves and their children, it is one of the objects of this deed to ensure. Therefore it is, that so many difficulties are thrown in the way of the admission of members. Were a system of prevention followed instead of punishment, laws would be unnecessary. And in all the transactions of life, the only effective precautions seem to be those which provide against the occurrence of evil, not those which attempt provisions for remedying the evil when it has occurred. It will be seen that this establishment is founded on the principle of community of property and labor, presenting every advantage to those desirous, not of accumulating money, but of enjoying life, and rendering services to their fellow creatures. These fellow creatures, that is, the blacks here admitted, requiting these services, by services equal or greater, by filling occupations, which their habits render easy, and which, to their guides and assistants, might be difficult, or unpleasing. No life of idleness, however, is proposed to the whites. Those who cannot work, must give an equivalent. 116. Socialism in America in property. Gardening or other cultivation of the soil, useful trades practiced in the society or taught in the school, the teaching of every branch of knowledge, tending the children, and nursing the sick, will present a choice of employments sufficiently extensive. Labor is wealth. Its reward should be enjoyment. Those who feel and admit this truth will see that it needs not to be rich, in the now received sense of the word, to contribute towards the building up of an institution, which, however small in its infancy, may be made, with their cooperation, to open the way to a great national reform. Deeds are better than words. After all that has been said, let something be at least attempted. An experiment that has such an end in view is surely worth the trial. To the friends of man and their country, to the respecters of the institutions of this republic, to all imbibed with liberal principles, to all who wish and believe in the possibility of the improvement of man, to all, in short, who sympathize in the sentiments expressed in this paper, this appeal is made. Let us, then, come forward. Let us dare to express our feelings and to act in accordance with them. Let us view, in a spirit of kindness, the prejudices, as well as the misfortunes, of our fellow beings, remembering that prejudice is not a crime, but an evil entailed by education and strengthened by habit. Witness my hand and seal this the 17th of December 1826.